Chapter 427, Cleansing, 2. It was the first time that Chu Lian was celebrating the new year in the Great Wu Dynasty. Although it was only going to be the two of them together for the festivities, Chu Lian didn't feel lonely at all. On the contrary, she was looking forward to it. Once the Kitchen God Festival had ended, time seemed to pass in a flash. In a blink of an eye, it was already the 27th, and there were only 3 more days to New Year's Eve. On this day, everyone had to bathe and cleanse themselves. The commoners living in the harsh environment of Liangzhou were no exception, even for the poverty-stricken. They would heat up pots of water and wash themselves with the scraps of soap they had collected in the summer to wash away the filth they accumulated in the year. This was all to ensure that they greeted the new year with a clean body. Early in the morning, Chu Lian was woken up by Wenqing. After washing up in a daze, she listened to Wenqing as she chattered on. "Third young madam, today's the 27th, the day of cleansing. This servant has prepared a flower bath for you. After lunch, you should take a bath and wash away your fatigue." Even out here in the freezing north, Chu Lian still kept clean and she would take a bath every 3 days, so she didn't take much notice of Wenqing's words. However, after putting on her face cream, she suddenly remembered about the bedridden Heartwarming. She asked, "Wenqing, is it an absolute must to go through the cleansing today?" Wenqing thought that she was interested in the tradition, so she explained with a smile, "Yes, we do. Even the guards watching the doors have to prepare their own baths to wash off the dirt of this year in preparation for the new one." A corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. Didn't that mean that the patient He Sanlang had to bathe too? How was he going to bathe with his body covered in scabs? Chu Lian felt a headache coming on. Chu Lian went to visit the recuperating Heartwarming after breakfast. After convalescing for 8 days, he was finally able to move his gravely wounded right leg. He no longer needed help from others to sit up or turn over. The moment she entered the outer room, a servant welcomed her. "Greetings to third young madam." Chu Lian nodded at her. "Is my husband awake?" The servant respectfully answered, "Third young master woke up 2 hours ago. Liue has already served third young master his breakfast." Chu Lian glanced into the room. She found it strange as Liue was always the first to welcome her whenever she came looking for He Sanlang, yet he was nowhere to be found. "What about Liue?" Replying to third young madam, Liue was sent out on business on third young master's orders early in the morning. Before he left, he said that he would only be back tomorrow morning. The servant took out a small wooden box from a cupboard and held it up with both hands respectfully for Chu Lian to inspect. Liue told this servant to pass on this message to third young madam. "Third young madam will have to help with changing third young master's bandages for today." Chu Lian. That clean freak He Sanlang didn't like others serving him and wasn't used to having maidservants around him. Other than Chu Lian, only Liue was allowed to change his bandages every day. Now that Liue wasn't around, this task had fallen upon Chu Lian's shoulders. Chu Lian suspected that she had walked right into his trap. She waved her hand to dismiss the servant and told Wenqing to pick up the medicine box instead. After a short pause, she entered the side room where He Sanlang was. Now that it was coming close to the new year, the whole capital was abuzz with activity. It was only in the Jingan estate that the atmosphere seemed a little gloomy. The roads to the north had been sealed by the snows, so there wasn't any news at all. He Erlang was still investigating the corruption case in Zhangzhou with Prince Jin. He had sent a letter back yesterday saying that he might not be able to get back to the capital in time for the new year. Matriarch He sat alone in the parlor of Qingxi Hall. Although she was dressed in riches, her silhouette looked pitiful amidst the understated luxury of her surroundings. She leaned back in her seat as she stared blankly at the entrance of the parlor, as if there would be someone entering and calling out for her in the next second. Senior servant Lu came in from the side with some teacups. The sight of the matriarch in this way made her heart heavy with sadness. Although the He family was few in number, at least they had second young master and third young master in the estate, as well as the two young daughters of the main branch to add a bit of liveliness to their festivities in past years. This year, the main branch was still in pandemonium over the new concubine, and the countess was bedridden and unable to attend the celebrations. They had been holding expectations of a new family member to join them over the new year after He Sanlang had married his wife, but fate had dashed their hopes. Sanlang and his wife were now out there in the north, and they didn't even know if they were faring well. The matriarch heard senior servant Liu's movements and came to life briefly. She touched the side of her head, where her hair was turning more and more white as days passed. Do you think this old woman has chosen wrongly by letting Lianer go to the north? How could senior servant Liu let the matriarch beat herself over this? The matriarch had spent so many days in her worries that her bodice condition had deteriorated. Senior servant Liu quickly consoled her. What are you saying, matriarch? The roads from the northern border have been blocked, there's no way for us to know anything. Perhaps third young master and third young madam are actually preparing to celebrate the new year over there. A wave of guilt rose in matriarchy's heart. It's all my fault, I didn't think it through enough. As master and servant were speaking, Muxiang suddenly entered in a panic. Senior servant Liu put on a stern expression. Is this how a personal handmaid should be acting? Muxiang paused and quickly collected herself. What is it? Speak. The matriarch ordered. Muxiang gulped before stammering out, Matriarch, many of the noble houses we've sent New Year gifts to have returned them to us untouched. Chapter 428, Losing Favor. 1. They returned the New Year gifts. Returning those gifts meant that they no longer wanted to associate with their house. Matriarch He slammed her palm heavily on the side table, causing the teacups to shake and clink. Are they trying to bully our house Jingon now that we have fewer members around? Matriarchy's chest heaved as she bellowed in rage. Senior servant Liu saw that matriarchy's complexion had turned pale and noted how she was desperately trying to catch her breath. She quickly patted the matriarch's back in fright and tried to reassure the old woman, Matriarch, please keep your health in mind. It's not worth it to let those Fairweather friends anger you so much that your health declines. The Countess is still bedridden and Erlang and Sanlang aren't around. This house still needs your support to stand strong. Matriarch He finally calmed down a little. She rested for a moment before questioning, which houses returned our gifts? Have you recorded their names? Muxiang had lowered her head during the matriarch's rage, not even daring to breathe until matriarch He had spoken to her. She obediently reported the names of every house that had returned their gifts in a small voice. Matriarchy's hands curled into fists. Remember all of those names. Since they don't want to associate with us any longer, we don't have to go out of our way to accommodate them either. Yes, matriarch. The matriarch paused and thought before giving them another order, get someone to bring over all the gifts that were sent back. I want to inspect them myself. Muxiang left to carry out her orders immediately. In half an hour, Muxiang returned with the stewards of the outer court, along with a group of manservants who carried the New Year gifts into Qingxi Hall's parlor. The stewards bowed respectfully towards the matriarch. Matriarch, these are all the gifts that were sent back from various noble houses. Matriarch He walked over to the gifts with the help of her cane. She pointed at the boxes placed on the carpet and ordered, open all of them. I want to see what's inside for myself. The manservants carefully opened up each of the red-carved wooden boxes. When Matriarch He was finally able to see what was in them, her eyes widened in disbelief. Her first reaction was to blow up in anger. Is this what you prepared as gifts? An absolute disgrace, the lot of you. The stewards were all frightened by the matriarch's temper and immediately kneeled down on the ground. Please have mercy on us, matriarch. It was eldest young madam who ordered us to do so. Although we felt that it wasn't appropriate, we couldn't disobey eldest young madam's orders. Matriarch was trembling with rage. She wanted to lift her cane up to teach all these servants a lesson, but she managed to restrain herself in the end. Senior servant Luke hurriedly stepped forth to support the matriarch. She was genuinely worried that the matriarch would faint from her anger. Matriarch, what's done is done. There's no way to make up for this even if you lose your temper. Matriarch took in a deep breath and let out a long sigh, seemingly having lost all her spirit in that one huff. She said with disappointment, "Tell them to dismiss themselves." Senior servant Lou waved her hand at the stewards kneeling on the ground. The stewards quickly took the chance to make their escape and left. Senior servant Lou helped Matriarch over to the warm hearth for a break. That Madame Zoe is becoming more and more careless. Send someone to bring her here. The matriarch's anger hadn't died out at all. She had only suppressed it momentarily. Once Madame Zoe appeared, the wrath of the heavens would likely rain down upon her. Just look at what she had prepared for the noble houses as New Year gifts. They would normally send out the highest quality of mountain ginseng, but it had been swapped for an inferior grade of ginseng. The jade Buddha statues in the gift boxes were actually made of flawed jade, and the high-quality Sincha tea cakes had been changed to low-quality loose-leaf teas. Madame Zoe had been in charge of the household for at least 5 or 6 years. How could she be so careless as to make such a terrible mistake? Shortly after, Madame Zoe rushed over to Qingxi Hall with her trusted senior servant and handmaid by her side. Granddaughter-in-law greets grandmother. Madame Zoe made a perfect curtsy without any fault. Even her expression was dignified and composed, without any trace of impatience or apprehension. Senior servant Lou frowned upon seeing Madame Zoe acting in this manner. The matriarch harumphed, "There's no need to greet me now. Just take a look at those gift boxes behind you." Hearing so, Madame Zoe finished her curtsy to the matriarch before turning to look at the brocade-lined gift boxes. When she was done, she turned back to the matriarch and asked curiously, "Grandmother, these are the New Year gifts I ordered the stewards to send to other noble houses. Why are they here?" The matriarch was almost forced to laugh from the intensity of her anger. "Madame Zoe, don't you know exactly why these are here in my hall?" It was only now that surprise showed on Madame Zoe's face. She asked with disbelief in her tone, "Grandmother, were these New Year gifts returned?" Matriarch's expression was overcast as she watched her granddaughter-in-law putting on a show. Madame Zoe walked over to Matriarch's side, her head lowered. She acted as if she was suffering some grievance and said, "Grandmother, it's not that granddaughter-in-law was trying to skimp on the New Year gifts, but the public funds are simply not enough. Granddaughter-in-law had no other choice." The matriarch frowned. "Didn't I draw Gillen Restaurant's profits into the public accounts?" Madame Zoe acted as if she was struck dumb and quickly explained, "Grandmother, Gillen Restaurant has already closed down since the middle of the month. Just a single month's worth of profits isn't enough for our New Year expenditures." "Closed down." Matriarch lapsed into deep thought for a moment. Although she now knew the reason behind the lackluster New Year gifts, Matriarch still couldn't forgive Madame Zoe's carelessness as the lady in charge of the household. She continued restraining her anger and replied, "No matter what, it's your responsibility that something like that has happened. I see that you no longer want to be in charge of the household. I'll be the one to take over your labors then. Return to your courtyard and reflect on your mistakes." Getting her authority revoked was something out of Madame Zoe's expectations. The alarm and astonishment she had been faking instantly became real. Her eyes widened, showing off her disbelief. It took her a good long moment to finally regain her senses and react to the order. She lost all of her noble reserve and dignity and kneeled in front of the matriarch, even going so far as to grab onto the matriarch's leg as she pleaded. "Grandmother, you can't do this. It was all my fault. I shouldn't have insulted the noble houses by sending such poor quality gifts. I'll make up for it right now. I'll use my own funds to make up for it. Please, give granddaughter-in-law a chance. Matriarch he seemed indifferent to her pleas. She looked at the sorry Madame Zhou as she declared, Madame Zhou, it's too late to regret your actions now. Servants. Send eldest young Madame back to her courtyard. Once Matriarch he had given the order, Madame Zhou was dragged out of the parlor by a few strong senior servants. Chapter 429. When Madame Zhou's cries could no longer be heard in Qingxi Hall, Matriarch he rubbed her forehead with fatigue. Some time later, she instructed, call all of the stewards and stewardesses of every courtyard here. I have some orders for them. Tell the stewards in charge of the accounts to come here as well. There was a never-ending stream of people coming to and from Qingxi Hall on this day. The whole estate soon knew that the heir's wife was no longer in favor with the matriarch. The moment Madame Zhou returned to her own room, she swept every single thing in arm's reach to the ground. It was only when senior servant Xiao hugged her tightly that she finally stopped her path of destruction. Eldest young madam, please calm down. You still have the two young misses to take care of. Little N and Little Lin had already been woken up by the commotion and had been drawn over to the noise. The maidservants and senior servants hadn't been able to hold back the two young misses, so the two children had witnessed Madame Zhou's fit of madness. Little N and Little Lin were frightened by the sight of their gentle and loving mother turned into a violent demon. Their young faces were filled with panic as they stayed rooted to the spot, not daring to make a peep. It was at this time that Madame Zhou turned to look at them. Her eyes were fixed upon them for a long time before her features contorted into a contemptuous snarl. Ha! Why weren't either of you born as boys? If one of you had been a boy, would I have fallen to this state? You useless things, get out of here. Senior servant Xiao was shocked to her core. She hadn't expected eldest young madam to have spat out such vitriol at the two children. Although eldest young madam had blamed herself for not being able to give birth to a male heir, she had still treated the two young misses with tender loving care. She had personally taken care of the children every day instead of leaving their care to the servants. This attack towards the innocent children was completely out of the blue for her. Although Little N and Little Lin were young, they were already aware of the situation. When faced with such contempt from their own mother, the two girls burst into tears in unison and ran towards Madame Zhou. They wanted to make sure that their mother's words weren't serious. Senior servant Xiao didn't dare to let the crazed Madame Zhou near the children right now. She quickly shot a look at Jin Shui, who caught the hint and ordered the maidservants to bring the two young misses out. After Little N and Little Lin had been taken away, Madame Zhou seemed to have calmed down from the sound of the children's cries. She collapsed into a chair, her eyes empty and listless. She was really done for this time. Her husband loathed her, the concubine was pregnant, and she had lost the power to manage the household once again. She, the wife of House Jing'an's heir apparent, was probably going to be the laughingstock of all in the capital. She suddenly recalled the strange letter she had received 2 days ago. That's right, it was that letter. That letter had urged her to send shoddy gifts to all the noble houses and to report the lack of funds to the matriarch. She was supposed to inform the matriarch of the fact that Gillen Restaurant had shut down, and the matriarch was supposed to take back the deed for Gillen Restaurant in a fit of temper. When the restaurant was placed back into the public accounts, she would then have the most profitable restaurant in the whole capital under her control. She had clearly followed the instructions on the letter through and through, so just how had things ended up like this? Lady Zhou frantically grabbed onto senior servant Xiao's arms as if she had finally found a straw to clutch at. Momo, that letter, where's that letter? Hurry, find that letter for me. Grandmother will surely return control of the household to me once she sees that letter. Although stunned, senior servant Xiao was able to recall the letter that the eldest young madam was referring to. A few days ago, eldest young madam had somehow been given a mysterious letter. She had sat down and read it by herself. Once she was done, excitement and malevolence had flashed across her face before she quickly tossed the letter into a brazier. Even she and Jean Shui hadn't gotten a glimpse of its contents. Senior servant Xiao sighed. She guessed that eldest young madam had been used by someone. Eldest young madam, you've already burned that letter. What? Burned? As much as she didn't want to deal another blow to Madame Zhou, senior servant Xiao still had to tell her the full truth. Madame Zhou blanked out for a moment before bursting out into laughter. It looked like she only had herself to blame. Matriarch sat at her desk and flipped through the account books. Her age was really catching up to her by now. She had only been reading for a short period of time, but her back and waist were already aching. Senior servant Lu couldn't continue watching without doing something. She brought up a suggestion. Matriarch, why don't you take a rest? The maidservants can help you with looking through the accounts and report a summary to you at the end. Wouldn't it be the same? Matriarch knew that her body couldn't take much more of this abuse, so she nodded in agreement. She pointed at Mu Xiang, who was waiting behind her. Mu Xiang, come and look through these accounts. If it's too much for you alone, pick 2 second-tier maidservants that you trust to help you with this. Mu Xiang quickly lowered her head and made a sound of agreement before sitting down and getting to work. Matriarch was helped to one side by senior servant Lu for a quick break. Go and see what has happened to Gillen Restaurant, and why it has suddenly shut down its business. Senior servant Lu immediately left to carry out her orders. Chu Lian led Wenqing into the side room where Sanlang was. The moment she entered, she was greeted with He Sanlang's usual frosty expression. He Chengdi sent a cool glance over before turning away. He even shifted his body so that his back was to Chu Lian. Following that, Chu Lian heard him speak, "Why are you here? Haven't you left me for dead?" Chapter 430. The Horrible He Sanlang. 1. Chu Lian froze for a moment from her astonishment. She hadn't expected those to be He Sanlang's first words after seeing her again. The way he was acting now was exactly like a dog that had been ignored by his owner. She didn't know how to react. The corners of her lips twitched and she headed over to the bedside with Wenqing trailing after her. She sat down on the stool next to the bed and started speaking. Since Liyue has gone out, they'll be the one to help change your bandages later. It's already the 27th, so you should take a bath at the same time. I'll put on your ointments after you're done with your bath. He Chengdi turned back around and looked at Chu Lian silently. Chu Lian remained her usual calm and easygoing self. He Chengdi, if you don't answer me, then I'll take it that you've agreed. After she was done, Chu Lian turned to Wenqing and told her to get the maidservants to prepare the items required for a bath. Just as Chu Lian stood up to look for bandages and gauze, He Chengdi directed his frosty gaze at the servants present in the room. The maidservants trembled and retreated quietly. A trace of satisfaction showed on He Chengdi's face. As Chu Lian set the bandages and gauze to one side, together with the ointments that she had ordered to be brought to her, she felt that the room was strangely quiet. It was when she turned around and looked around the room that she realized she and He Chengdi had been left alone. She put the medicine box down and shot a confused look at He Sanlang. Where's everyone? He Chengdi was calm as he replied, I've sent them away. Ah. Chu Lian didn't understand. What had he sent them all away for? Is there something important you have to tell me? Chu Lian sat down next to He Sanlang and drew close to him, expecting some secret. Although there was still some distance between them, He Chengdi could already smell the fragrance on Chu Lian's body. He couldn't tell what fragrance she used, but he just thought that it was very nice. There was a faint smile in He Chengdi's eyes, though he wasn't aware of it. He tilted his body slightly to become even closer to Chu Lian. His breath was now gliding across Chu Lian's soft cheeks. It's not anything major, but I want you to help check my wounds. They were hurting a little when I woke up this morning. He Sanlang's tone was very cool and impersonal. Aside from his heated breathing, he had managed to hide his evil intentions very well. If this had been a normal situation, Chu Lian would definitely have been able to detect the white lie in his words. However, when it came to matters concerning his body, Chu Lian instantly tensed up and forgot her usual calm. Astonishment and reproach were displayed on her expression as she admonished him. Did it only start hurting this morning? How about during the past 2 days? He Changdi, are you stupid? Why didn't you mention your wounds hurting before? Why would you bear with the pain silently? Once she had finished her scolding, she quickly reached out for the blankets covering He Changdi. The old physician had gone home for the new year the day before yesterday. Since He Changdi's injuries had been healing well, Chu Lian had not asked the old physician to come to the He estate every day. Before the old physician had left, he had also left instructions for them. As long as his bandages were changed daily and he continued drinking his medicine, he would be able to walk in another month. After the few days he had spent recuperating from his wounds, there was no longer any danger to his life. It was only a matter of time before he was fully healed. However, Chu Lian had also seen the state of He Sanlang's injuries with her own eyes. His leg had been a bloody mess at the time and it was extremely frightening. That was why she reacted immediately when He Sanlang mentioned that his wounds hurt. He Sanlang suddenly felt guilty upon seeing how panicked Chu Lian was over him. He wanted to reach out to hold her still and stop her frantic movements. However, Chu Lian couldn't rest easy until she inspected his wounds personally after finding out that his wounds were hurting. In the modern world, there were many cases where external wounds would fester and become inflamed if they weren't taken care of properly. If that happened to He Changdi, the result would be even worse than the original state of his injuries. Chu Lian pushed away He Sanlang's hand and puffed up her cheeks. She threw a glare in He Changdi's direction with an angry huff. Don't you dare move, or your wounds might be affected. Although Chu Lian had been going for a fierce tone, her voice was naturally soft and charming. Even though she tried to harden her stance, there wasn't a single threatening bone in her. Instead, He Changdi felt warm inside. He wanted to pull the angry little kitten in front of him into his arms for a nice round of snuggles and pets. It was only then that He Sanlang finally realized he wasn't going to win over his stubborn wife when she was on a roll. Thus, with a resigned smile, he laid back against the headboard and let her do as he wished. The wound on He Changdi's right leg was on the inner part of his thigh. Actually, it was very dangerous to have a wound at that spot as it was close to a major artery. Any cuts could easily cause extreme blood loss and death. Lucky for He Sanlang, he had somehow escaped that fate. The wound hadn't gotten close to his artery. Right now, he was only dressed in a pair of really short pants to make it easier to change the bandages every day. The pants were so short that they only covered the most important parts of his lower body. Once Chu Lian had gotten the blanket out of the way, she was met with the sight of He Sanlang's muscled thigh all covered in bandages. She glanced at him and said, "Bear with it for a while, I'm going to remove the bandages and check on your wound." Before He Sanlang could give his assent, she had already started to untie the bandages. The corners of He Changdi's lips twitched. How were her movements so fast? He watched Chu Lian's serious expression as she went about her task. Although his features were still locked in their usual cool mien, there was warmth welling up deep inside his heart. It had been a long time since he had experienced being cared for like this. Chapter 431, The Horrible He Sanlang. 2. Chu Lian's fingers were nimble and she quickly but carefully took off the bandages covering He Sanlang's leg. She looked at the wound on his knee first and found that the wound had already scabbed over. The surrounding skin was also clean and dry, so there was nothing wrong with it. Chu Lian frowned and traced the wound upwards. She started checking on the injuries on He Sanlang's inner thigh. Since He Sanlang couldn't move his leg right now, Chu Lian had no choice but to move into another position and climb onto the bed. She kneeled on the inner side of the bed while bending over to take a good look at the wound. He Changdi hadn't thought much of her inspection at first, but her unintentional pose made his thoughts run wild. His gaze flitted downwards, only to see her fair little face near a very important part of his body. He had already fallen for Chu Lian, and desperately wanted to be closer to her physically, so it was even harder to restrain his reaction. Chu Lian hadn't noticed her lunatic husband's response at all. She finished inspecting that wound on his right thigh and found that it was actually healing pretty well and that there was no problem with it. The realization that he had been lying, coupled with how he had tried to stop her earlier, hit her like a ton of bricks. She instantly puffed up with anger. Due to her fury, her face flushed red and even her almond-shaped eyes were lit up with the fire of her rage. Chu Lian harumphed. She looked up, about to vent her temper on He Changdi, when her gaze accidentally fell upon a part of his body that was a little abnormal right now. What could a thin pair of shorts hide? The excited little brother he stood out clearly. Chu Lian's eyes widened in disbelief as all of the blood in her body rushed into her cheeks. Her blush even extended all the way down to her neck. It took Chu Lian a dazed 2 seconds before she quickly moved away. Following that, her limpid eyes directed towards He Sanlang in complaint. She gaped for a while as she tried to recover her lost wits. Finally, she spat out, "He Changdi, you pervert." In the whole of the Great Wu dynasty, He Sanlang was like the only one who had ever been branded a pervert by his own wife. He Changdi was also both ashamed and frustrated at his own reaction. The roots of his ears were also completely red. However, he still managed to keep his aloof expression on his face as he stared at Chu Lian's lobster-red face in a daze. After a while, he tried to explain in a raspy voice, "I didn't do it on purpose, I couldn't hold it back." Chu Lian's response was to shoot a fierce glare at him. The meaning behind it was clear. Could you be any more shameless? He Changdi. Chu Lian's heart was thumping rapidly in her chest. Even though she had lived in the modern era for over 20 years, she had never experienced anything like this before. Her face was so red that it felt like it was on fire. She wanted to escape from this awkward situation as fast as she could. Chu Lian scrambled off the bed in a panic, intending to pull on her shoes and run away. However, the more panicked she was, the clumsier she became. As she was getting off the bed, she accidentally tripped over her own skirt and almost tumbled right off the bed. Luckily, He Sanlang had been watching her the whole time and was able to catch her at the right time. With a tug of his strong arms, Chu Lian landed in his embrace. Chu Lian had already gone through the whole spectrum of emotions by now. The fright from the near fall shocked her into a dazed state. Bewilderment filled her eyes, softening her usual sharp wit and adding an extra trace of cuteness. Urged on by that lovely sight, He Changdi's pupils dilated before he bent over to capture those rosy red lips. The soft and slightly cool feeling that met his lips sent a wave of enjoyment crashing through his whole body. Ever since they had shared their first kiss in the tent, the memory of it would pop up in his mind from time to time. Each time he reminisced about it, he would feel even more drunk on the feeling of love. Chu Lian hadn't expected this sudden attack from He Sanlang at all. Her almond-shaped eyes widened as far as they could go and she struggled in his grasp. Her muffled grunts didn't do anything to move him and she didn't have any strength to push him away. She wanted to try kicking instead, but when she remembered that his leg was still heavily injured, she stuck to using only her hands to push against his chest. However, Chu Lian's weak arms were like ants trying to push down a tree. Once He Changdi had tasted enough of the sweetness of her lips, he gently pushed past her teeth to brush against her tongue. He Sanlang had become even more familiar with this after the first time. The all-consuming kisses made Chu Lian short of breath. Although the force of her arms against his chest slowly weakened, Changdi wasn't willing to let her off so easily. The hands he had placed on her back started wandering and caressing her. Although she was dressed in layers of clothing due to the cold weather, he was still able to hold on to her slender waist easily. With a slight pull of his hand, she was now flush against his body. It was only when Chu Lian's face had flushed completely red again that Sanlang finally let her go. Even then, he wasn't willing to part with her. He showered kisses lovingly on her fluttering eyelids, the bridge of her nose, the fine corners of her lips and her dainty little chin. Chu Lian had almost fainted over from the lack of air during their kiss. Her mind was a complete blank while her body felt like a wet noodle. All she could do was gasp for air right now, so she didn't have the spare energy to mind the light kisses that he was dropping on her face. However, it didn't take long for her to recover. When she finally realized that there was something hard jabbing her in the waist, Chu Lian's soul instantly returned to her body. Right as Changdi's trail of kisses had reached Chu Lian's slender neck, she shot out a hand to cover his face. Sanlang, why are you so horrible? The air between the couple had turned harmonious all of a sudden. By the time Changdi had his fill of snuggling, the two of them were panting for breath. Sanlang cradled the back of Chu Lian's head with his palm, pressing her head on his broad chest. He took a deep breath to gather his determination before declaring, Chu Lian, once I'm fully healed, let's get together. If that's all right with you. This time, Chu Lian didn't shove his words back in his face like she had done previously in the army camp. She gripped his collar tightly as she rested her head on his chest. After a moment, her low and muffled voice resounded. There weren't any words in her reply, just a simple affirmative mumbled into his shirt. The anxiety in Sanlang's heart instantly transformed into a burst of fireworks, overwhelming him and giving him the urge to fly up into the sky. 15 minutes later, Changdi pulled Chu Lian away from him with his strong arms, tugging her slender body out from his embrace. It was rare for them to have such a warm and peaceful moment, so Chu Lian didn't want to move at all. She looked up with confusion at Changdi, asking with her soft voice, "What's wrong?" Sanlang leaned over to place a kiss on her tender pink lips. "Be good for me and get off the bed first. I'm afraid I won't be able to hold back any longer." A blush returned in full force to Chu Lian's face and she quickly scurried out of his arms awkwardly. She put on her embroidered shoes again and straightened out her clothing before shooting a fierce glare at Changdi. "I'm going to find a razor. You have to shave your stubble now." After giving herself a shoddy excuse, Chu Lian turned and made her escape from the room. After they had finally agreed to be together, even though their following interactions weren't very intimate, it took Sanlang a lot of effort to control his physical reactions so that it wouldn't cause more embarrassing incidents. Changdi was a very restrained person in the first place. Although it was hard for him to hold his bodily reactions back, when he thought of how Chu Lian had finally agreed to be with him, this sweet torture felt like nothing. Chu Lian didn't give much thought to their snuggling at all. As a woman, she didn't have much in the way of sexual needs. Instead, she rather enjoyed the sweet closeness they shared. When Chu Lian finally found a razor and returned to the room, Changdi didn't let her do it for him and shaved his own stubble. Later on, with Chu Lian's help, he wiped down his body and washed his hair. He couldn't take a bath due to the position of his injuries, so he could only make do. Once the 27th had passed, New Year's Eve soon arrived. There was a touch of celebration in the air, even in the frigid north. Naturally, Liangzhou city was the most festive compared to the other cities nearby. Chu Lian had gotten up early in the morning to start preparing dinner for the new year. Wenqing and Wenlan were also so busy that they didn't have any time to rest. Manager Qin and his subordinates finally returned to the He estate in the afternoon. Wenqing and Wenlan knew that Manager Qin had gone out on third young madam's orders, but they didn't know what exactly he had gone out to do. However, they weren't too curious about it. They knew that anything done on third young madam's instructions was definitely good for their household and good for third young master, so there was nothing for them to worry about. Chu Lian had ordered Wenqing to start cooking a large pot of braised pork in the morning. Wenqing had found it strange and asked, "Third young madam, even if we give a whole bowl of this to everyone in this estate, we won't be able to finish this up." Chu Lian smiled secretively, "You'll know why when it comes to dinner time." Since Chu Lian had already explained it like that, Wenqing dropped her line of questioning. Chu Lian found it funny. She refused to believe that Captain Gua and the others wouldn't come over to the He estate to beg off a free meal when faced with such a great excuse. Chapter 433, The New Year, 2. As expected, when night fell and the maidservants had just started serving up a whole array of steaming hot dishes on the table, the gluttons from the northern border troops arrived. He Changdi was bedridden, so the only person who could host their uninvited guests was Chu Lian. She stood at the main entrance in welcome and looked upon the huge group of foodies helplessly. It seemed like it wasn't just He Sanlang's band of brothers who had come. Even Great General Qian had followed along. Of course, Sima Hui was here too. Chu Lian was starting to suspect that the extra portions of food she had ordered Wenqing and Wenlan to prepare weren't going to be enough. However, it was too late to prepare more food. If they really ran out of food, they would just have to add on a big bowl of dumplings for them and make sure that they left with full bellies. In order to match the festivities, Chu Lian was wearing a pink dress with white rabbit fur accents. There was a bright red vest on top of that and a white fox fur cloak on the outside. Some baby fat was still clinging on to her tiny little face, giving her a youthful air. When she was dressed up in so many layers, she looked like a cute little bull. After Chu Lian personally greeted Great General Qian with a respectful bob, General Qian pulled out a red packet from his sleeve and passed it to Chu Lian. "Take this, it's a New Year gift from your Uncle Qian." Chu Lian stared in a blank daze for a moment before quickly reacting and receiving the envelope with both hands. She smiled at General Qian, "Uncle Qian, I'm already married, I'm not a child any longer." Although her current body was only 15, she had been in her 20s in her modern world and was long past the age where she would receive red packets from her elders. When she had gone home for the new year in the past, she had even given out red packets to her nieces and nephews. Now that an elder had suddenly given her a red packet, Chu Lian felt a little awkward. While Duke Lu was the fearsome Great General Qian in the border camp, he had come here to visit her as an elder, so she had changed her form of address for him accordingly. General Qian found it amusing that the little honored Lady Jeannie was acting like an adult. "Even though you're already married, you're just a young lady who has just come of age. Don't tell me that you're too shy to accept your Uncle Qian's red packet." Chu Lian smiled in return and said, "All right, please don't tease me, Uncle Qian. I'll accept it." Now that General Qian had opened up the way, the rest of the people who had come for her cooking all gave her red packets. Even the youngest Xiao Hongyu managed to take out a thin red envelope and pass it to Chu Lian. He showed a foolish smile and said, "I don't have much savings, so please don't take offense, sister-in-law." Although Xiao Hongyu called Chu Lian older sister-in-law, he was actually older than Chu Lian by 4 years, so it was still acceptable for her to accept his gift as a junior. The last person to enter was Sima Hui. Chu Lian hadn't seen her in quite some time, so she was naturally happy to meet her friend again on New Year's Eve. Sima Hui was normally taller than Chu Lian by half a head. Today, she had stuck a red feather in her neat hair, making her look even taller and slimmer than usual. Sima Hui offered up a smile and pulled on Chu Lian's hand in a familiar way. She took off a red purse with embroidered flowers from her waist and gave it to Chu Lian. "Lianer, I didn't prepare a red packet for you unlike the great general and the others. Take this as Sister Hugh's New Year gift to you. Chu Lian's smile was even brighter than usual as she dispensed with the usual courtesy of rejecting the gift. She reached out to receive the purse immediately. Since it's something that Sister Hui prepared for me, I'll accept it shamelessly. Once Chu Lian had finished accepting a stack of red packets and one red purse, she finally welcomed everyone into the He estate. While He Changdi and Chu Lian were passing their first New Year together with a lively celebration, things weren't going so well back in the Jingan estate in the capital. It was now certain that Count Jingan couldn't come back for the New Year, while second young master He Changjue, who was investigating a case in Zhangzhou, had also sent a letter stating that he wouldn't be able to make it either. Eldest young madam was grounded in her branch's courtyard. It was rumored that she wasn't feeling very well these 2 days and that senior servant Xiao had taken over management of her own courtyard's matters. Matriarch He had just taken control of the household again and was going through the public account books. The sudden stress and hard work had caused her old illnesses to flare up and made her bedridden. Eldest young master He Changshi disapproved of his grandmother's overwork. He specially ordered senior servant Lu to keep watch over the matriarch's health. Senior servant Lu had no other choice but to take up the task of checking the accounts herself. She picked a portion of the account books and left the rest to Muxiang. Senior servant Lu wasn't good at numbers, so it was Muxiang who oversaw the accounts. At the end of the year, rumors started swirling about the capital that the northern border troops had fallen into critical danger and that it wasn't boding well for the 50,000 troops hanging in the balance. Matriarch He's health declined even further upon hearing these rumors. Due to the spreading of the news in the capital, many noble houses stopped associating with House Jingan. TL note: red packets are given to young children for the Lunar New Year to bless them. It used to be given in the form of coins, treated as lucky amulets to chase away evil spirits with the hope that children would grow up safely. The red packets are usually given by senior family members to children. The typical practice in modern times is to continue giving the red packets to any single junior family members even into their 20s. The expectation is for young married couples to give out red packets to junior family members as well. However, when you get to your 20s, you do get embarrassed about taking money from your elders, hence Chu Lian's reaction. For General Qian and the others, it's their way of sending well wishes to Chu Lian and her hubby, plus it lessens their guilt over showing up unannounced for the meal face with tongue. Chapter 434, Eldest Madam Returns, 1. On the following day, Matriarchy's health had deteriorated so much that she was too weak to get out of bed. He Changshi had suddenly become the only master in the entire estate who was entirely healthy and normal. He Changshi was actually mired in his own worries and he was in no mood to celebrate the new year. Each day, he would leave early in the morning to search for any news of the situation in the north, only returning late at night. He even used his connections to send a request to Princess Wei. Early this morning, the silent and subdued entrance of the Jingan estate suddenly turned lively again. A few carriages marked with the flags of the Jingan estate stopped in front of the estate's gates. Following that, a green-clad maidservant jumped out from the lead carriage before quickly setting out a wooden stool by the carriage. She lifted up the curtain covering the carriage entrance and carefully helped the person within the carriage out. The first to emerge from the confines of the carriage was a young lady wearing a dark green hood. She looked to be about 15 or 16 years old. Her figure was slender and she was dressed in a plain-colored vest over a reddish-brown dress. Closely following behind her was a middle-aged woman. The woman was slightly plump and was wrapped in a brocade cloak. Her hair was combed up into a conch shape, with only a simple silver hairpin to decorate her black hair. She turned her head slightly and patted the young lady's hand, as if reassuring her. Her face actually held some resemblance to House Jingan's matriarch. "Nianjin, this is your grandmother's home." He Ying's voice was clearly emotional right now. The gaze she was directing towards House Jingan's gates were filled with both yearning and greed. Pan Nianjun hugged her mother's arm tightly. Uncertainty and envy showed in her narrow eyes as she took in the large and luxurious gates of the Jingan estate and the roofs of the buildings within. She gulped nervously. "Mother, grandmother's home is so huge. I've never seen such a large courtyard in my whole life. Can we stay here forever from now on?" The corners of He Ying's mouth tilted upwards. "Of course. Since we've returned, no one can chase us out." Senior servant Liu had hurried over with some servants in tow after receiving the report from the gatekeepers. Ever since He Ying had married into the Pan family, far away in Xiyang, they hadn't met at all for decades. Now that she was meeting the He family's former eldest young miss again, a mix of emotions welled up within senior servant Liu. She walked up to He Ying and bobbed in greeting towards her, together with the servants behind her. It was only after a respectful pause that she raised her head and said, "Eldest madam, it must have been a long journey for you. Please, follow this servant into the estate." Even though it had been many years since they had last met, He Ying was able to recognize the senior servant who was even more well-dressed than she was. "Senior servant Liu, I hope you've been well since we parted." After saying so, He Ying rearranged her expression into a frown as she took in the servants who had come to welcome her together with senior servant Liu. All of a sudden, she let out a mocking peal of laughter. "I see that we're not that welcome after all, since you've only sent servants out to welcome us back." Senior servant Liu's expression changed. She pressed her lips together and managed to hold back the sharp words bubbling up within her. She lowered her head respectfully as she replied, "Eldest madam might not have gotten the news yet. None of the male masters of our house are home now. The matriarch and the countess are both sickly and bedridden, so the honor of welcoming you has been left to this old servant." He Ying's brows drew together. "Mother is sick." Senior servant Liu nodded, her heart clearly aching for the matriarch. "Eldest madam and Miss Pan, please enter first and listen to this old servant's explanation later." It was only then that He Ying stopped talking and let the maidservants help her and her daughter into the estate. The news had been sent to Qingxi Hall already. Perhaps due to the pending reunion with the daughter she had been separated from for decades, the matriarch was much more spirited than the 2 days before. She forced herself out of bed and on her feet. The matriarch let her maidservants help her dress up before letting Musheng escort her to the hearth in the parlor. It was there that she awaited the arrival of her long-lost daughter. Matriarchy's old eyes remained fixed on the entrance the whole time. Eventually, she urged, "Muxiang, send someone to ask if they've entered the inner court." Muxiang covered her lips and smiled. "Of course, this servant will go now. Please don't worry, matriarch. Eldest madam has already entered the estate, it will only take her a moment to come into the inner court. Senior servant Liu has even sent out sedans for them and specially arranged for the most fleet-footed menial servants to carry them. They won't be delayed." The matriarch sighed. "I know that, but I just can't help myself." Just as Muxiang walked over to the parlor entrance and lifted up the heavy drapes covering them, she spotted senior servant Liu leading a group of people down the corridor. She turned around joyously and said, "Matriarch, eldest madam has arrived. Quick, welcome them in." Matriarchy was so happy she almost leaped up from the hearth, giving Muxiang a fright as she hurriedly went over to support the matriarch. The haughtiness on He Ying's face immediately faded the moment senior servant Liu lifted the curtains. Once she entered the parlor, she fixed her eyes on the old woman sitting by the hearth. Tears seemed to spring to her eyes almost instantly. "Mother." Matriarch, he looked down upon the daughter who had left her as a young lady and grown into a middle-aged woman. Her old eyes looked hazy as tears welled up. "Miss Ying, come to mother's side and let mother take a good look at you." He Ying ran forward and threw herself into matriarchy's arms. The mother and child who had been separated for years hugged each other tightly and cried their hearts out. Pan Nianjun was at a loss for what to do. She shrunk back and looked up at the kindly matriarch sitting at the head of the room before her attention was attracted by the sumptuous luxury of the parlor furnishings. Her eyes darted here and there, looking over everything with desire. TL note, the titles that the servants use go by the relation of the addressee to the current head of the house. Matriarch He, mother of the current count, 1 generation up, equals Matriarch Ying, sister of the count, same generation, equals eldest Madame Chu Lian and Madame Zhou, daughter-in-laws of the count, 1 generation down, equals young Madame's Pan Nianjin, maternal niece, 1 generation down, but not within the family, equals Miss Pan, meaning lady of the Pan family. The servants use for Miss Pan, which is literally a cousin miss, to indicate that she's related to the family, but not through the direct line. Chapter 435, Eldest Madam Returns. 2. Senior Servant Lu and Senior Servant Zhou were afraid that the matriarch's fragile health would decline even more if she went through more emotional upheaval, so they hurriedly spoke words of reassurance. Matriarch, now that eldest madam is back and the new year is coming, you should be happier. Miss Pan is watching from the side. As expected, with the reminder that her granddaughter was watching, matriarchy slowly got her emotions under control. She let go of her daughter and dabbed at her tears before finally getting a good look at her daughter. When she was satisfied, she turned her gaze to her granddaughter, Pan Nianjin. Ying pulled her daughter closer. Nianjin, this is your maternal grandmother. Quick, greet her. Pan Nianjin was a little timid. She darted a glance at the kindly yet intimidating old lady before her and greeted in almost a whisper, Grandmother. What a good child. The matriarch reached out and took Pan Nianzhen's hand in her own. She carefully looked over the young lady before asking, how old is Nianjin this year? Ying looked at her daughter with pride. Her coming-of-age ceremony was done just this summer, so she'll be 16 this coming year. 16 years of age. That was considered an adult woman in the Great Wu dynasty. It was also the right time to start preparing for marriage, and it wouldn't be good to tarry on that matter. An idea sparked to life within matriarchy. She let the two ladies sit down next to her. At the same time, she had also noticed that they were dressed in rather plain and shabby outfits. Ying seemed to have sensed her mother's measuring gaze. She lowered her head in shame. The matriarch frowned. Why are you dressed in this manner? Ying glanced at her mother. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, but it seemed like her shame was holding her back. Even if you don't want to dress up, you should have given Nianjin a few good dresses at least. She should be dressing prettily at her age. Once matriarchy had spoken, Ying could no longer hold back her words. Mother, it's not that I'm not willing to, but I just don't have the money right now. Matriarchy stared in disbelief. Did you spend all of the silver I gave you back then? Ying acted aggrieved when reminded of the money she had been given. Mother, it's been so many years. How could there be anything left from just those 10,000s of taels? Matriarchy deeply regretted that she hadn't raised Missing properly. She was actually dismissing those 10,000s of taels. How could 10,000s of taels be a small amount? 10,000s of taels was enough to buy at least 10 or more storefronts. Even if they did nothing with the storefronts and rented them out, they would be able to live much more comfortably than they seemed to be now. She would at least have the money to make some new clothes and accessories for her daughter. The frustration within the matriarch almost shot through the roof after that casual comment from her daughter. However, as angry as she was, she couldn't just let her daughter and granddaughter continue dressing so shabbily. She looked her daughter up and down once more before speaking again. The two of you can stay in my Qingxi hall for now. You're about the same size as I was back then, so you can take some of my clothes for now. Muxiang, lead eldest madam over to the storehouse in a while. Muxiang respectfully acknowledged the orders. Matriarchy looked at the timid Pan Nianjin and faced a dilemma. Pan Nianjin was 15 this year and in the prime of her life. Matriarchy didn't have any clothes suitable for her to wear. Even if they ordered the seamstresses to rush out something, it would still take a few days. It was already close to the year's end, so the clothes stores outside were all closed. They wouldn't be able to buy any ready-made dresses. It was really a tough problem for the matriarch. Senior servant Lu was observant. She smiled and whispered a suggestion to the matriarch. Matriarch, why don't you send someone over to third young madam's courtyard to ask? Now that senior servant Lu had reminded her, realization dawned upon the matriarch. That's right. Samlang's wife was also 15. Although the two young ladies were a little different in size, it wasn't so drastic. Shang Yun, take Miss Pan over to Samlang's courtyard and borrow 2 outfits for the time being. Get our seamstresses to measure the 2 of them tomorrow afternoon to make some outfits they can wear, matriarch he instructed senior servant Lu. Once those details were settled, matriarch he held on to her daughter's hand and started chatting about their past memories. Ying wanted to get closer to her mother, so she put all her efforts into caring for the matriarch. They started talking about Ying's childhood and kept chatting until it was time for the midday meal. In the afternoon, they had lunch served in the parlor of Qingxi Hall. Matriarch he shared the meal together with her daughter and granddaughter. On the table was 8 treasure duck, boiled fish with pickled cabbage and chili, imperial tofu, pork strips in chili sauce and meatballs in clear soup. There weren't that many dishes, but Ying and her daughter were stunned. They had never eaten or even seen such exquisite dishes before. The parlor was filled with the fragrance of food. Mother, what is all this? Ying pointed at the dishes and gulped. Matriarch he puffed up with pride at the mention of the food. These dishes were all taught to our estate's cooks by Lianer. They're much better than what we had before. Come, have a taste. Nianjin, start eating. Ying found it strange. Mother, who's Lianer? One of your maidservants? Matriarch he glared at her daughter upon hearing so. What nonsense are you speaking? Lianer is your niece-in-law. She married Sanlang this year in early autumn. Ying's eyes almost bulged out at her shock. Sanlang is married. You silly child. Have you forgotten everything as the years passed? Sanlang is already 20 this year. Important matters like marriage can't be delayed. Upon hearing her mother's reply, a trace of disappointment flashed across Ying's eyes. All right, that's enough of that. Let's eat first. Once we're done, Shang Yun will explain everything that has happened on our estate. None of what her mother and grandmother were talking about had gone into Pan Nianzhen's ears. She had just taken a bite of the 8 treasure duck and almost swallowed her tongue along with it because of how tasty it was. She couldn't help but think, how could there be such delicious food in the world? TL note, what a feast. 8 treasure duck boiled fish with pickled cabbage and chili pork slices in chili imperial tofu, pingqiao tofu, meatballs in clear soup also. Just a reminder that we actually have a food glossary complete with pictures and recipes, thanks to Inmi Kitchen. Chapter 436, Borrowing Clothes. 1. Although Pan Nianjin had heard her parents talk of the riches and luxury of the capital in the past, it was nothing compared to seeing it for herself. Setting aside the exquisite decorations, clothes, and jewelry, even a simple meal here was 100 times better than what the wealthy in Xi'an had. If even House Jinggan was living in such luxury, one could imagine just how amazing it would be in the houses of the first-rate nobles. Pan Nianjin felt that she had made the right decision to come to the capital with her mother. It was no wonder that her mother missed the capital so dearly. Once she thought of it this way, Pan Nianjin began to envy the noble ladies who grew up here. She stealthily glanced at matriarch he who sat at the head of the table with a grudging look. Even though the capital was so rich and lavish, even though House Jinggan was obviously thriving, it wasn't until autumn this year that her grandmother had allowed the 2 of them to return. It had been a long time since matriarch he had been this happy. She kept adding food into their bowls. Satisfaction warmed her heart as she watched them enjoy their meal. No matter what Hiying had done in her youth, she was still Matriarchy's very own flesh and blood. Matriarchy only had this one daughter as well. Now that decades had already passed, her daughter had likely undergone enough suffering and hardship in the outside world to learn her lesson. It was fine if her daughter now returned to stay and pass her days happily with her again. As for this granddaughter of hers, Matriarchy planned to treat her well. The 6 dishes should have been more than enough for the 3 of them, especially since the matriarch had a small appetite. There should even be leftovers. However, all of the plates were completely wiped clean. When Hiying and her daughter were done, there was no longer any food left in sight. They had even used some plain buns to soak up all the remaining gravy in the sliced pork dish. It was only after setting down their bowls and chopsticks that the 2 finally noticed the discomfort from their bloated stomachs. When they looked again at the messy table, as thick-skinned as she was, even Hiying's face flushed red. The servants waiting on them had awkward expressions as they looked at them. Even Muxiang was looking at them with some contempt. The matriarch, on the other hand, had a gentle look in her eyes. She asked with sympathy, "Have you had your fill? If you want more, you'll have the kitchen cook a few more dishes." Hiying quickly shook her head. "It's fine, mother, we're already full." As they had eaten too much at lunch, Hiying and her daughter rested in a side room in Qingxi Hall for over 2 hours. When they woke up, senior servant Lu led Pan Ninjin to Songtao Court to borrow some clothes. Once they arrived at the entrance of Songtao Court, senior servant Lu happily introduced the place to her. "Miss Pan, this is the residence of 3rd young master and 3rd young madam." Pan Ninjin looked into the courtyard. Although it was winter, it didn't seem chilly here at all. There was even some greenery left in the garden amidst the decorative mountains, and there were some winter-sweet flowers blooming to the side. She looked at the place with admiration and envy. Back in Xiyang, only the elders of the family would get to live in a courtyard as lovely as this. The junior members of the family wouldn't get a turn at all. So her older cousins had been living in such a wonderful environment their whole lives. Senior servant Lu wasn't bothered by her silence. She just continued introducing the interesting things in the courtyard, not knowing if Pan Ninjin was actually listening. Chapter 437, Borrowing Clothes, 2. In the main room of Songtao Court, a servant had just informed Xian, senior servant Gui and the others of this matter. Xian was in the middle of cataloging all of Chu Lian's accessories together with the other servants. She had heard from some of the servants in the outer court that an eldest madam had come to the estate, but she hadn't expected that eldest madam to bring her daughter over to Songtao Court. She put down the register, and brought the servants over to welcome her. Pan Ninjin was politely escorted to the main room of Songtao Court, while senior servant Lu tactfully explained the situation to Xian. With a slight smile, Xian said, "Since that's the case, please follow this servant, Miss Pan." Pan Ninjin carefully sized up the decor in the main room of Songtao Court. As her gaze swept the room, a book placed on the side table caught her eye. That was the book that Xian had been using to catalog Chu Lian's accessories. Pan Nianzhen's appearance had been so sudden that she had forgotten about the catalog, even though she had ordered the servants to keep the jewelry. Xian had left it open on a little table near the hearth. It was unfortunate that it caught Pan Nianzhen's eye. At first, Pan Ninjin had just glanced at it due to curiosity. However, when she read the names of the accessories recorded on the book, she was first startled, before envy and jealousy flooded her heart. Golden hairpin with sapphire and jade inlays, 8 treasure hairpin with pearl chains, dangling hair ornament shaped as a blooming blossom with ruby. The names of some accessories leaped out at first glance. They sounded like they were worth a few hundred taels at least. In Xiyang, even the provincial official's wife didn't own such jewelry. Pan Ninjin was overcome with jealousy. In her mind, Chu Lian was merely the wife of the third young master, but she had so many expensive accessories. What about the wives of the first and second sons then? Xian, senior servant Lu and the others didn't notice where Pan Nianzhen's gaze had been directed. Xian continued with a smile, Miss Pan, please follow this servant, third young madam's clothes are all in the bedroom. Although Chu Lian wasn't home, Xian still followed their standard procedures and switched out the clothes in the closet for ones suited for winter. Once the closet was opened, it became too dazzling for Pan Nianzhen to behold. Her mouth was agape as she looked at the various winter clothes in disbelief. Her eyes were filled with greed. When Xian looked towards the fragile-looking Miss Pan, she noticed that something was amiss with her gaze. She turned her head to check what she was looking at. When she realized that Miss Pan was eyeing the clothes in the closet, her brows knit together. Chapter 438, Third Young Master is here. 1. My sincerest apologies, Miss Pan. Since third young madam isn't here, we servants can't act on our own initiative. Although Xian was speaking tactfully, the meaning in her words was clear. The clothes that Princess Wei had given to Chu Lian couldn't be lent to her. Pan Nianzhen scrunched up the handkerchief in her hands, showing her displeasure. She wanted to continue insisting, but senior servant Lu quickly jumped in upon seeing the situation turning bad. Miss Pan, these clothes over here are all in the latest styles and colors trending in the capital this year. Miss Pan will surely look good in them. Pan Nianzhen's hopes were left unfulfilled. In the end, she picked from the winter clothes that the estate had given to Chu Lian for the year. In a fit of temper, she picked out 6 sets of clothing from the closet, practically taking all of the winter clothes that Chu Lian had been given. Xian stood to one side and watched. Although her heart ached for the clothes taken away, she couldn't do anything to stop it as a mere servant, especially since her masters weren't even around. All she could do was to stand by respectfully and let Miss Pan Nianzhen take them away. Once the group of visitors had taken a box full of clothing and left Songtao Court, the second-tier maidservant Baicha asked, Sister Xian, are we going to let those people take third young madam's things away just like that? This servant thinks that Miss Pan isn't a good person at all. Xian turned around and shot a glare at Baicha, we're servants. Even if we want to protect our third young madam, we can't go over the authority of the other masters in this household. We have to keep our thoughts in our hearts and remember everything that happens. Well, report all of these to third young madam when she's back. Third young madam will know what to do. Also, while it's fine for you to say something like that in front of me, keep your lips sealed around others, or we might accidentally make new enemies for our masters. While our masters aren't around, we servants of Songtao Court must behave ourselves. Baicha nodded. Baicha will remember Sister Xian's teachings. Alright, don't just hang around me now. Go and put third young madam's clothes back in order. Record all of the clothes that Miss Pan just took. We have to make sure we keep our record straight. After getting her orders, Baicha went off to do her work. Xian watched as the young girl hurried off diligently and smiled. Although Baicha was only 12 this year, she was good at her work. In fact, she was even more trustworthy than Jingyan and Fuyan. When senior servant Lu returned to Qingxi Hall, she mulled over the issue for some time before reporting what Pan Nianzhen had done at Songtao Court to Matriarch He. The matriarch's first reaction was stunned amazement. Later, she sighed, that child has grown up by her mother's side all these years and has never seen enough of the world. Since it's her first time here, she's more shallow-minded. It's still within the realm of forgiving. Shang Yun, tell the inner court steward to add a few more headdresses and accessories for Miss Ying and her daughter. Take another 2 headdresses from my personal stores for them too. Senior servant Lu hadn't expected such a reaction from Matriarch He. Not only had she not increased her guard against them, but she was even pitying eldest madam and her daughter. While senior servant Lu wanted to try persuading otherwise, she knew clearly that matriarchy wouldn't listen to her at this time. Thus, she could only resign herself to following her orders. Eldest Madam Hing was in her 40s this year. Her figure was slightly plump and her round face was similar to matriarchy's, but with fewer wrinkles. The two lines framing her mouth were rather deep, giving her a mean appearance. After her afternoon nap, Hing started strolling about Qingxi Hall. She looked closely at every corner of it. This courtyard hadn't changed much overall since she had left, but there were a few parts that had changed a lot. The furniture and arrangements throughout the courtyard had become even more lavish. She could tell that Qingxi Hall had gone through at least 2 renovations after she had left to marry in Xiyang. Ever since she had stepped into the Jinggan estate and all the way till the midday meal had ended, she had felt that the current house Jinggan couldn't be compared to its former self from 20 years past. In these 20 years, House Jinggan had already made its footing in the capital. The corners of her mouth tilted upwards in a smile, deepening the wrinkles around her lips and making her look even more harsh. As she turned around, her gaze landed upon a half-open window. This corridor ran parallel to Qingxi Hall's little study. The study was originally where matriarchy took care of the household matters. However, after the old count had passed away, matriarchy had moved her own study into the old count's study in the outer court instead, to remember her husband, leaving the little study empty. Now it was used by the trusted servants in Qingxi Hall for their work. Through the half-open window, she could see the matriarch's most trusted handmaid, Mu Xiang, seated at a desk with an abacus. Eldest Madam Hing thought for a moment before walking over. The study was quiet and there was only a maidservant watching the door. However, the maidservant had already dozed off in front of a brazier, so Hing was able to sneak into the study. Mu Xiang was staring at the account books and working diligently. The clacking of the abacus beads hid the sounds of the footsteps behind her. Hing looked over at the account books that Mu Xiang was working on from a meter or 2 away. Her eyes widened and she sucked in a breath. What kind of storefront was that? How was it able to earn so much money? It was bringing in more than 3,000 taels of income a month. Her gaze quickly darted up to the start of the entries, only to see 2 words printed at the top, Gillen Restaurant. Gillen Restaurant? Wasn't that part of her mother's dowry? Even at its peak, it had only been one of the oldest restaurants in the capital at most without anything special to it. How had it suddenly become a money tree? 3,000 taels. That wasn't a small sum. Most noble ladies wouldn't even be given that amount in their dowries when they married. This Gillen restaurant was bringing in 3,000 taels of pure profit each month. Back then, when matriarchy had sent her away to Xiyang, she had only been given 10,000 taels of silver. Ying's eyes lit up instantly. Chapter 439, Third Young Master is here, too. When Mu Xiang turned around and noticed eldest madam standing behind her, her expression changed and she quickly shut the account book. She stood up to give her greetings. Eldest madam, how did you come to be here? Ying had recovered her senses by now. She hid the greed in her eyes and raised her chin. I was just taking a walk around since I was bored. Why? Are you trying to pry into my business? Of course not, eldest madam. If eldest madam wishes to take a stroll, this servant will arrange for some of the brighter maidservants to accompany you. Although it's winter, there are still some scenic areas around our estate. Ying could sense that this handmaid Mu Xiang was more stoic and stubborn. She thought for a bit before replying, I won't trouble you. I'll go over to the matriarch. Continue with your task. Mu Xiang escorted eldest madam to the door before turning back to deal with the skiving maidservant guarding the door. The little maidservant trembled and pleaded for mercy, but Muxiang's face was contorted into a fierce expression. Another maidservant standing at the side couldn't hold back her own tremors upon seeing Muxiang's appearance. Back in Liangzhou on the night of New Year's Eve, the guests who had come to the He estate were now seated together in the parlor after eating their fill at the feast. They stayed up to usher in the new year until it was past midnight. Chu Lian then ordered the servants to bring them to some rooms to rest. Chu Lian returned to her own little courtyard and placed all the red packets and one purse she had received that night on the table. She sat next to the table and opened up the red packets using the faint light of the lanterns around her. Opening these red packets was like opening presents. The most enjoyable part was the surprise right before opening the envelopes. She hadn't gotten any red packets for a long time back in the modern world, so she wanted to experience the delight of it again. Meanwhile, although it was already the new year, Sanlang was still pulling a long face in his room, causing the whole room to be enveloped in cold. Liyue stood to one side with a conflicted expression. He didn't know whether he should sit or stand. He rubbed his hands together and said, "Third young master, it's already late. Your wounds aren't completely healed yet, why don't you sleep earlier?" Changdi didn't look at him. Instead, he showed his palm to Liyue. "Give it to me." Liyue quickly pulled out a thin and exquisite wooden box out of his clothes and offered it up to his young master with both hands. "Third young master, it's right here." This servant kept it close at all times. This servant didn't dare to be careless with it. Changdi took the wooden box without another word. An idea flared to life in Liyue's mind and he coughed lightly. So it hadn't been for him to touch, it was to ask him for his present. Sanlang felt like he had been dealt a blow. The icy countenance that had thawed a little froze right over again. He scanned the young girl before him with half-lidded eyes. He was fuming inside and he wanted to punish this wicked woman. Unfortunately, his heart was willing but his flesh was weak. Sanlang retracted his gaze and didn't reach out to continue touching Chu Lian's hand. Chu Lian thought that he was purposely feigning ignorance and was about to speak up when she heard a violent fit of coughing from him. Chu Lian's brows creased together and she asked with worry, "What's wrong? Are you feeling unwell? Is it because you had a drink earlier? Brother Gua and the others are really too much. Even if we're celebrating the new year, they shouldn't be getting a sick person to drink." Chu Lian grumbled on and on, until Wenlan couldn't hold back any longer. "Third young madam, the outer room's windows are still open for ventilation." "Chu Lian, why are the windows open at the peak of winter? Hurry up and close them." Chu Lian awkwardly ordered. Wenlan was speechless. It had been third young madam who had complained that the room was too warm due to the hearth in the first place and ordered them to open the windows. Wenlan shut the windows before turning around and making a suggestion. In this servant's opinion, third young master and third young madam should move to the inner room to talk. Chu Lian thought it over and asked Changdi, "Do you need someone to carry you over?" Sanlang shook his head, "It'll be fine if you help me. Only one of my legs is injured. I can't walk too far, but such a short distance is fine." Chu Lian also felt that it would be too heartless to wake the servants up at this time, since most of the servants had already gone to rest for the night. Thus, she followed his wishes and supported him by lending him an arm. Knowing that third young madam's body was slender and fragile, Wenlan was afraid that she wouldn't be able to support their tall third young master. She was about to step forward and offer her help, but before she could walk over, she felt a frosty glare from Changdi. Wenlan was so shocked that she stayed rooted to the spot. Realization dawned upon her eventually. She was really dumb. Of course third young master was still able to walk. He obviously wanted to take this opportunity to get closer to third young madam. She was overjoyed for third young madam. As long as third young master cared about their third young madam, their days would only become more and more blissful. With a smile, Wenlan stealthily retreated to the side room, and even dismissed the two maidservants that were on duty. Chu Lian's head was at the same height as Changdi's shoulders, and that was only because she had grown a little last year. Otherwise, she would only be as tall as his chest, like before. Despite all that, she still appeared frail and puny beside He Sanlang. He Changdi rested an arm on Chu Lien's shoulders. With half of his body leaning on hers, he carefully got off the hearth bed. His large black cape practically covered Chu Lien's whole body. The two of them were so close that Chu Lien could smell the bitter ointment on his body. With the two of them like this, it didn't look like Chu Lien was supporting him. Instead, it seemed more like He Changdi was embracing her. Actually, He Changdi wasn't even putting much of his body weight on her because there was no way she would be able to shoulder that burden with the little strength that she had. The young couple then entered the bedroom together. Chapter 441, Warmth, 2. The incense burner in the bedroom was giving off a faint watery fragrance. The decor of the room made it clear that it belonged to a lady. He Changdi took in the entirety of the room in one glance and frowned, as if he wasn't satisfied with how the room was only suffused with her taste. He decided that he would have to add his own touch to this room in the near future and turn this living space into a mix of their styles. He Sanlang's gaze finally landed on the desk in the room. There was a lotus lantern on the desk, lighting up the plain brocade-lined surface. A stack of opened red envelopes and a small pile of banknotes and silver ingots, as well as a slightly open purse, were placed on the table. It looked like she had stopped in the middle of opening the purse. Chu Lien looked around the room as well. The whole courtyard was small, so even though this was the main room, there wasn't much space inside. There were only the most basic furnishings, a bed, closet, chairs and a desk. There wasn't even a single chaise here. He Changdi's thigh was wounded so he couldn't sit down. Thus, she could only have him lie down on the bed that she used. Chu Lien had no other choice but to help He Sanlang over to her bed. She gave him a long cushion to lean against. "Take off your cloak." He Sanlang stretched his arms upwards to let Chu Lien take off his cloak, which she then hung over a nearby screen. When she turned back, Chu Lien noticed that her husband was staring at the pile of red envelopes on the table with creased brows. She explained with a smile, "Uncle Qian and the others gave those to me as a blessing when they came over to eat." As she was saying this, her eyes sparkled. He Sanlang could tell that she was truly happy over receiving these red envelopes despite how there weren't even 50 taels of silver in total. He Sanlang couldn't help asking, "Didn't you receive red envelopes in the past?" Chu Lien blurted out the truth without thinking, "It's been years since I last received a red packet." It was only after speaking that she remembered that she was supposed to be House Ying's sixth miss and not Chu Lien from the modern world. An awkward silence ensued, causing Chu Lien's happy expression to cool off into indifference. He Sanlang was absolutely stunned by what she had said. He had heard about things to some extent and he had even sent someone to investigate her after he reincarnated, so he definitely knew about her situation back when she was still in the Yin estate. Her birth mother had died earlier and her birth father was absent from her life. Her stepmother was harsh towards her. There were plenty of children in House Ying and the old Duke and Duchess favored boys over girls, so Chu Lien had never gotten much love from her family. Even though she had her loyal and caring nursemaid Senior Servant Gue by her side, Senior Servant Gue was just a servant after all. It felt as if 1,000 needles were pricking his heart. In the past, he had wished for her to receive all of the suffering in the world, but now he couldn't bear to listen to even a single one of her bad experiences. He adjusted his expression and waved at Chu Lien, who wasn't too far away. When Chu Lien saw that he wasn't going to pursue that line of conversation, she quickly walked up to him, wanting to bury the earlier topic. He Changdi caught her wrist and pulled her into his embrace. While his tone remained cold, there was a hint of warmth when he spoke. "I'll give you a red packet every new year from here on out." Chu Lien was frozen stiff. She hesitated for a moment before turning her head to meet his gaze. Her heart was full of self-reproach and warmth at the same time. Here she was afraid of exposing her true identity, yet he was trying to soothe her past wounds. Actually, this lunatic husband of hers was a true tsundere, a person with a sharp tongue and a soft heart. Even the rational Chu Lian had a sour feeling in her heart. She scolded the past Chu Lian angrily in her mind. You stupid idiot. Why did you abandon such a good husband? You were really dumb. However, she was glad that this good husband was now all hers. Chu Lian blinked in an attempt to stop the warm tears in her eyes from spilling. She sent a pout to He Changdi and couldn't hold back the urge to tease him when she saw how serious he was. How much are you going to give me then? I don't want it if it's too little. He Sanlang had a sincere expression on his face as he reached out to touch her soft and delicate face gently. I'll give you everything that I have. Chu Lian had only been trying to tease him. Who could have expected words like that to come from He Sanlang's mouth? Chu Lian gaped a little from her astonishment. Are you stupid? If you give me everything that you have, then what about yourself? Most men usually think of ways to hide their money instead. What if I'm a spendthrift and I end up spending all of the money you give me? A rare burst of laughter spilled out from He Changdi. He tightened his hold around her and enjoyed the warmth of her soft body against his. If you spend it all, then so be it. You're my wife anyway. If you really spend it all, you'll have to go out and beg for food with me. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. This naive He Sanlang was assuming that she wouldn't leave him in that case, just because they were married on paper. The two of them continued hugging for a while before He Changdi finally took out the long, exquisite wooden box that Laiwa had given him earlier. This is for you. He Changdi looked down at her with love and devotion in his eyes. Chu Lian was astounded, so there was really a present for me. When he had ignored her in the outer room after she had demanded that he take his present out, Chu Lian had assumed that he was only using that as an excuse to visit her. He would have to sell himself to get that much money. Chu Lian presented the jade amulet to him on her palm. The white jade amulet sat prettily on her fair and soft hand, dazzling He Changdi's eyes. He raised an eyebrow in question, asking her what she was doing with his gaze. Chu Lian lifted a hand to her forehead and puffed up her cheeks. A little speechless from her slow-witted husband, she said, "Help me put it on. Didn't you buy this for me to wear?" It was only then that He Sanlang took the jade amulet from her with a poker face. He lifted up the hair covering her back, revealing a fair and smooth neck. Following that, he helped her put on the horse-shaped jade amulet with gentle hands. Her porcelain white skin made the gold and red string of the amulet stand out. The red string wandered down her neck and ran parallel to the curve of her chin, placing the amulet right in front of her chest. The jade amulet sat there above her bust like a beautiful accent to her beauty, leaving his mark on her. Chu Lian pushed away the arms that He Sanlang had wrapped around her and turned around. She looked up at him with a lovely smile and asked, "Does this look nice?" Warmth had already melted the ice block on He Sanlang's face. He reached out to touch the jade amulet on her chest and nodded cheerfully. "Beautiful," he murmured in a low and husky voice. Chu Lian was taken off guard by his sudden passion. She quickly stuffed the amulet into her clothes and got off the bed in one swift movement. She walked over to her desk before speaking, "Go ahead and rest first. I'm not done with opening my red packets, you'll sleep right after that." Although He Changdi seemed a little embarrassed, he didn't stop Chu Lian this time. He had already made it into his wife's bed anyway. Now that he had achieved his goal, he wasn't too bothered by other minor details. After experiencing that heart-pounding moment, Chu Lian actually didn't have the mood to continue opening her New Year's gifts. She was only using them as an excuse to avoid him because she was too shy to face him right now. In an absent-minded daze, she opened up the purse that Sima Hui had given her. The ties keeping the purse close had already been undone earlier. Chu Lian simply appended the purse onto her palm, causing whatever was inside to slide out. Something cool fell onto her warm palm, surprising her. Jolted out of her daze, she looked down at it. Her first reaction was a stunned silence, before she quickly closed her fingers around the item and snuck a look behind her at Changdi, who was lounging against the headboard of the bed. She smiled at him a little stiffly. Sanlang caught sight of her gaze and frowned. He asked suspiciously, "What's wrong? What's in that purse?" Chu Lian quickly explained, "It's nothing, it's just some banknotes. I'll go and get Wenlan to bring some hot water in." After saying so, she quickly left the bedroom. Changdi watched as his wife practically sprinted out of the room. His eyes darkened over. Why would she have to go out of the room to get the servants to bring some hot water in? The side room where the servants rested was placed right next to this one. Most master bedrooms had a rope connected to a bell in the side room so they could call the maidservants in with just a simple tug. Chu Lian patted her chest once she was out of the bedroom. A whoosh of air signified her relief from the awkward situation. She swiftly hid the item in her hand. If that lunatic Sanlang saw this, it would surely leave a blow on his heart. Luckily she had been sitting with her back facing him. Chu Lian sighed and called out to Wenlan before returning to the bedroom. When Chu Lian returned, Sanlang didn't say anything, as if he hadn't noticed anything strange about what had happened just now. Once Chu Lian had finished washing up for the night, he went to sleep with his arms around her. Chapter 443, Giving his wife a present. 2. The next day, on the dawn of the first day of the year, the sound of firecrackers could be heard all over the normally desolate Liangzhou city. Even though they were out here in the north, there were still customs they had to follow. Chu Lian woke up bright and early in the morning to prepare New Year gifts for General Qian and the others. When Chu Lian woke up, Sanlang was still sleeping. She carefully tucked the blankets back around him without waking him up and quietly got off the bed to put on her clothes. Once Chu Lian had left the bedroom, Sanlang opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for a while before finally moving the covers aside and moving out of bed. He took the cloak that was still hanging on the screen before heading outside. Wenqing was on duty in the outer room. Sanlang's sudden appearance gave Wenqing a fright, as he was hobbling and favoring one leg. "Third young master, this." Changdi sent her a cold glare and order in a frosty one, "Go and guard the door. Don't let anyone in." Wenqing looked back at him in surprise, but unfortunately, she couldn't withstand Changdi's ice-cold gaze for long. She gave in to the threatening aura around her young master and obediently followed his order to guard the door, despite the uncertainty in her heart. Once Wenqing had left and shut the door, Changdi started opening up all the cabinets and chests in the outer room. After training in the army, Changdi had gotten pretty skilled at tracking. He found the traces left by Chu Lian and quickly found what he was looking for. In just a few moments, as he was digging under the pillow on the hearth bed, he felt something icy cold and pulled it out. When he got a good look at it, he instantly froze up. It was a jade amulet carved into the shape of a horse. Although it was also made of white jade, both the craftsmanship and quality of the jade were better than the one he had given her. He had grown up in a noble house, so he had a discerning eye for quality. This jade seemed quite old. It was probably something from the previous dynasty. It might even have come from the imperial palace, making it priceless. His gift couldn't even be compared to this jade horse. However, Chu Lian had quietly hidden this piece away. A warm feeling suffused Sanlang's heart. He understood why Chu Lian had done so. After a momentary daze, Changdi carefully hid the jade back where he had found it and called Wenqing back in. He leaned against the headboard of the hearth bed coolly with a neutral expression. The threatening air around him, honed by his time in the army, made Wenqing lower her head in deference. She and Wenlan had grown up under senior servant Zhong's guidance. They hadn't seen third young master much when they were young. Now that she had finally met her master again in the north, she always felt pressured whenever she was around him. She didn't even dare to lift her head before him now. Wenqing gulped anxiously and asked, "Third young master, do you have any orders for this servant?" Sanlang's tone practically dripped icicles. "Who gave your third young madam that purse yesterday?" Wenqing hadn't expected her master to ask something like that. She was worried that the purse might have caused some sort of misunderstanding between him and third young madam, so she quickly explained, "The red purse with embroidered patterns that third young madam received yesterday was from General Sima. This servant witnessed it personally. Please don't mistake it as third young madam receiving a present from some stranger." Chengde's eyes narrowed into slits. Sima Hui. It was that Sima Hui again. Chu Lian is his wife. What was she trying to move in on? That damned butch. Wenqing felt like her head was still in the clouds even after she was dismissed. She couldn't wrap her head around why third young master had only asked her a single question about the purse before letting her go. Left alone in the room, Sanlang leaned against the headboard in deep thought. He hadn't bothered much about material items before. As long as he had enough silver to buy what he needed, he had felt perfectly fine. Furthermore, there usually wasn't much that he needed to spend on in the army. However, it looked like it wouldn't do if he continued like this. He had to start earning some money. At the very least, he had to be able to afford better presents for his wife so that he wouldn't get outshined again. Chu Lian spent the whole afternoon busying herself with the New Year gifts before ordering Imo Chingue to send them to the army camp, along with some of the family soldiers. Just as she finished that task, Manager Qin came into the main room, beaming from ear to ear. During this period of time, he had been busy with what Chu Lian had ordered him to do. His whole figure had slimmed down, compared to back in the capital, and his face had become sharper. As the saying went, every chubby man was an unpolished jewel. Once he had slimmed down, Manager Qin was a rather good-looking man himself. The way he smiled before saying anything made him look like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was looking more and more like a proper steward as time passed. Chu Lian was sitting on the hearth bed in the main room, drinking some red bean and lotus porridge. When she saw how radiant Manager Qin seemed to be, she smiled back, "Is there some good news?" Manager Qin never forgot his manners in front of Chu Lian. He bowed respectfully to her first and spoke some customary words of blessing for the new year before moving on to report on his tasks. "When there's a will, there's a way. This servant has finally fulfilled third young madam's order." Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes lit up. The speed at which Manager Qin had accomplished her request was out of her expectations. She set down the porcelain bowl in her hands to ask, "When can we start operating?" "The day after tomorrow at the latest. The barbarians don't celebrate the New Year. This period is when there's great demand for material goods. This servant has already inquired about the location. There are 18 places in total. We'll send the goods over in the next 2 days. As long as we have enough manpower, we'll be able to start operating immediately." Chu Lian was generous with her praise. "You've done well for this task. Remember what I said to you last time. Offer whatever goods we manage to get to the northern border troops first. Move whatever they don't want according to the plans I've given you. Also, give the northern border troops 40% of the profits we make from this. Well, keep the other 60%. Thus, House Jingon received an invite from Prince Wei's estate the next day. Even though Princess Wei was hosting a large celebration this year, it was still very low-key compared to other members of the imperial clan. There were only 10 or so noble houses who received invites, so these invites were extremely precious. They were a mark of association with Prince Weiss' estate. House Jingan wouldn't receive an invite normally, since their house didn't have any connections with Prince Weiss' estate. However, thanks to Chu Lian, Princess Wei had sent House Jingan an invite this time. Those who didn't know about Princess Weiss' connection with Chu Lian would think that it was House Jingan's prestige that had earned them an invite. He Ying was one of them. Matriarch He was extremely happy about receiving an invite and took it very seriously. She immediately ordered senior servant Lu to prepare the gifts. He Ying pleaded with her mother for half a day before the matriarch finally agreed to bring her and her daughter to Princess Weiss' birthday banquet. If not for the lack of other female family members to accompany her, since her daughter-in-law was still bedridden and her granddaughters-in-law weren't present, Matriarch He wouldn't have agreed to bringing He Ying and Miss Pan so easily. On the morning of Princess Weiss' birthday, He Ying and her daughter got up early to prepare. The two of them were staying in a side room in Qingxi Hall now. Matriarch He had given them some of her maidservants to serve them, and all of the maidservants had been trained well, so their standard of living was much better than before. Eldest Madam and her daughter, Miss Pan, had brought a maidservant each back from Xiyang. The one serving He Ying was called Qiuyun and the other serving Miss Pan was called Pinglu. Pinglu was older than Qiuyun by a year and was already 16 this year. She was small and frail-looking. Apparently, she had been trained as a female escort before entering the estate as a maidservant. Once mother and daughter were both dressed up, they went to Matriarch He's bedroom in Qingxi Hall together. Matriarch He inspected their dressing and accessories personally and made sure that there was nothing offensive about them before leading them to the carriage that would take them to Prince Weiss' estate. The entrance at Prince Weiss' estate was currently filled with arriving guests. The young royal princes were standing at the door to welcome their guests, along with Princess Weiss' trusted senior servant and court ladies. It was Pan Nianzhen's first time attending such a grand banquet, so she was a little timid. Once she was helped out of the carriage by a maidservant, she kept her head low and followed right behind her mother and grandmother, imitating their every step. When Princess Weiss' trusted senior servant Lan, noticed that House Jingan's matriarch had arrived, she walked towards their party with a welcoming smile. This old servant greets the matriarch. It's already the end of the year, but our house has troubled Matriarch He to make the trip all the way here. Princess Wei was still telling this old servant last night that she feels guilty for it. Senior servant Lan had a rank as a court lady in the palace, as she acted as Princess Weiss' subordinate. With her rank, she didn't actually have to bow towards the madams of the various noble houses. She was treating House Jingan's party with respect purely due to Princess Weiss' affection for Chu Lian. Chapter 445, Princess Weiss' Birthday Banquet 2. Matriarch He had been living in the capital for so long that she understood all the nuances of the etiquette in play here. Her face was kindly, making her look approachable despite her age. There's no need for you to greet me. It is my honor to be invited to Princess Weiss' birthday banquet. I will have to trouble senior servant Lan to pass on my blessings to Princess Wei. He Ying was standing to one side. When she saw how courteous her mother was acting towards a servant, disdain surfaced on her expression. This person wasn't even the princess herself, she was only a servant. Did her mother really need to fawn over a mere servant like this, with her title as first-ranked noble wife? Could it possibly be her age getting to her? Senior servant Lan was sharp-eyed, as befitted her position. She had caught He Ying's small movements. You're too courteous, matriarch. This old servant will pass on your words to Princess Wei later on. It'll be the eve of the new year tomorrow. Has there been any news from honored Lady Jeannie in the north? Senior servant Lan had mentioned Chu Lian in front of Matriarch He at this time on purpose. A smart person would instantly realize what she meant. Matriarch He had never been a slow-witted person as the de facto leader of her family. Senior servant Lan wasn't really asking about news of Chu Lian. Princess Wei had sent 2 of her bodyguards along when Chu Lian had left for the north. If there was really any news, Prince Wei's estate might even find out earlier than they did. Right now, she was using the mention of Chu Lian to remind her that the only reason they had received the invite and why they now able to mingle with Prince Wei's estate was purely due to Chu Lian's efforts. When you drink water, think of the person who dug the well. Matriarchy sighed, I have not received any news of her. I've always been thinking of Lianer, please pass on my gratitude to Princess Wei for remembering Lianer. If there's any news, I'll definitely send a message to the princess immediately. When senior servant Lan saw that the matriarch had understood her reminder, she ended the topic. She spoke up courteously, look at this old servant has completely forgotten about the time while chatting. Apologies for keeping matriarch here out in the cold wind. This old servant has failed in my duties. Matriarch, it's getting late. This old servant will guide you to the inner court. Ying had already lost her patience some time ago while waiting. It wasn't until the 3 ladies had gotten onto the sedan that the prince's estate had arranged to take them into the inner court that matriarchy finally got the chance to give a stern warning to her daughter. Miss Ying, what kind of look was that just now? Matriarchy intoned. Ying was too stubborn to accept the scolding and snapped back, Mother, what were you doing talking so nicely to an old servant? Even if she's dressed lavishly, she's still just a servant. We'll lose our dignity if we lower ourselves in front of a servant. Matriarchy harumphed, annoyed with her daughter's tone. What do you know? That servant you're talking about is a highly ranked court lady. Her rank is even higher than yours. Ying was frozen stiff in shock. That old woman is a court lady. Matriarchy suppressed her rage, not wanting to have it out with her daughter at this time. However, her tone turned more icy, put away that haughtiness of yours. This birthday banquet is extremely important, and so are all the guests here. If you offend a respected personage and make enemies for me, they'll send you right back to Xiyang. Ying shrunk back. It was only after the matriarch had pulled out that threat that she really felt fear. Back when she had still been a young miss in House Jinggan, the house hadn't been as illustrious as it was now. They didn't even have a noble title then. Old Count Jinggan had earned that title by risking his life on the battlefield. Thus, she had never interacted much with the nobles in the capital. It was normal that she wouldn't realize an unassuming senior servant would be a formally titled and ranked court lady. The court ladies' ranks in the Great Wu dynasty were equal to ranked noble madams. Senior servant Lan was a 7th-ranked title at the very least. That was much higher than Ying's own rank now. Furthermore, court ladies had always been looked up to. After this small commotion, Ying decided to give up all of her airs and remain low-key on this day. The timid Pan Ninjin had also been properly frightened from all this. The capital was really teeming with all sorts of noble ranks. If a stone randomly fell from the sky, it would likely hit someone with a noble title. Princess Wei was waiting in the main hall of the inner court for her guests. There were many esteemed madams and misses here today. Some of them were the noble wives of the ministers of the cabinet. There were even some high-ranked imperial clan members around. Even matriarchy wasn't able to lift her head high in front of all these people. She hurriedly gave her greetings to Princess Wei before retreating from the circle with Ying and Miss Pan. Old Duchess Sheng and a few other senior members of noble houses were gathered in one area, naturally forming a social circle. Matriarchy entered the circle and sat down. Old Duchess Sheng greeted her with a smile, it's just us old ladies left in this circle. After saying so, she glanced over at Ying, who was behind matriarchy. Old Duchess Sheng was close with matriarchy and knew about all the events that had happened in their estate a few decades ago. She frowned slightly before continuing, when did Miss Ying return to the capital? Matriarchy set aside the ill feelings in her heart and returned the smile. She came back just a few days ago. After so many years, I just couldn't rest easy with her raising her child in Siyang. The young ones in my estate aren't around much, so I get lonely easily. Thus, I thought of bringing Missing back. While old Duchess Xing didn't approve of the matriarch's decision, she kept it to herself and didn't make any mention of it in front of Ying. She nodded. It's good that you've brought her back. Now that we're old, all we want is to see our children happy by our side. Following that, old Duchess Xing turned to Pan Nianjun, whose head was still pointed at the ground. This is. House Jingon didn't have any young misses around this age. She had seen Chu Lian a few times before, so she would recognize her if it was Chu Lian. Matriarchy smiled. This is my granddaughter. She came back from Siyang along with her mother. Chapter 446, News reaches the capital. 1. Realization dawned upon old Duchess Xing. She sized up Pan Nianjun seriously for a moment. The way the young lady kept her eyes down shyly was much more to her liking than how her mother acted. As matriarchy's old friend, she couldn't help but be curious. How old is she? Is she engaged yet? She just had her coming-of-age ceremony this year. She'll be 16 in the new year. Why, she's a full-grown lady already. Isn't that exactly why I'm worrying about it now? Old Duchess Xing chuckled and shot her old friend a look. All right, I understand. I'll keep an eye out for you. If there are any suitable families, I'll bring it up with them. The matriarch was glad that her friend could help her, of course. Meanwhile, the young miss in question sitting behind matriarchy ducked her head down as her cheeks flushed upon the sudden mention of her future engagement. He Ying's expression turned. Her mother was trying to marry her daughter off to someone else. Right now, she and her daughter were penniless and helpless. They didn't have any noble titles or ranks and she was a widow. Even with House Jingon backing them, her daughter wouldn't be able to attract a good family. It would most likely be a poor minor official's family or some noble's son with something wrong in his household. Compared to that, wouldn't it be better to let her daughter stay in House Jingon? They would be able to stay in her maiden home forever then. She hadn't been slacking these few days in her maiden home. She had gone around listening to all the news she could get about the estate. Her elder brother had 3 sons. The eldest and the youngest were married, but the second one, Erlang, was still single. Furthermore, he was working for Prince Jin in Zhangzhou. His future was extremely bright. Ying had her own plans for her daughter's marriage. The conversation between matriarchy and old Duchess Xing had agitated her and she now felt that she should push her plans a little earlier. As she was thinking of how she could do that, old Duchess Xing spoke to Pan Nianjun. Royal Princess Duanjia is here. She's going to take all of you young ladies off to play. Why don't you follow along? Everyone turned towards Princess Wei. The pretty young lady dressed in bright red with a white fox fur cloak was obviously Royal Princess Duanjia. Royal Princess Duanjia gave her birthday wishes to her mother before she was ordered to take care of all the young noble misses who had come today. Matriarchy turned to look at Pan Nianjun. Go on. It's rare for the royal princess to be in the mood to socialize. There'll be more to talk about with young ladies your age. However, after she thought on it a little more, she couldn't rest easy sending Miss Pan away alone, so she ordered senior servant Lu to follow. Pan Nianjun was still hesitant. Most of the beautiful young ladies in the group following after the princess had very high statuses, so it was rather intimidating. However, just as she raised her head, she caught a threatening glare from her mother. Pan Nianjun didn't dare to disobey her mother. She stood up and bid her goodbyes to the older women before rushing off to follow Royal Princess Duanjia. Princess Duanjia didn't like to socialize with all these fragile noble misses in the first place. It just sucked all the energy out of her just looking at them. If it hadn't been a very special occasion for her mother, she would have snuck off to lay somewhere by now. She sighed inwardly. When was that darn Chu Lu coming back? She was going to die of boredom here in the capital. Of course, Pan Nianzhen's identity as a distant relative of House Jingon wasn't enough to attract Princess Duanjia's attention. The princess didn't like hanging around with so many people, so she was only doing the bare minimum of hospitality for her guests. Thinking of the task her mother had given her, she led the group of ladies over to Plum Pavilion. It was the end of December, so it was just the right season for plum blossoms. There had been plum trees here in this plum pavilion in Prince Wei's estate since the previous dynasty. After 100 years or so had passed, the branches of the old plum trees had become gnarled and they bloomed even more vigorously. Princess Wei loved plums, so Prince Wei had ordered all sorts of plum trees to be planted here. The current plum pavilion was overflowing with plum trees in full bloom. Their beauty and aroma had long become one of the famed winter scenes in the capital. There was a special corridor built in the plum tree garden of Plum Pavilion, where some tables and chairs had already been placed. Light muslin veils were covering both sides of the corridor and braziers had been placed within. The moment they entered the corridor, a burst of warm air surrounded them. It was a really good location for admiring the plum blossoms. However, it wasn't just the plum blossoms they were meant to be admiring today. Right next to this walled-off garden, with just a single barrier separating them, came a burst of men's voices and laughter. Once they heard the sounds of young men so close to them, most of the young ladies instantly knew what the real purpose of this plum blossom party really was. All of them exchanged glances and smiles. Instruments of the four arts, zither, go, calligraphy and painting, had been placed in the corridor. They were meant for the young ladies to play with and pass the time, but mainly for them to show off their talents in front of the young noblemen. Once Royal Princess Duanjia had led the party of ladies in, she leaned against a chaise in the corner with a completely disinterested expression. She had no interest in this matchmaking party. After she ordered Jinxiu to pour a cup of honey water, she sipped a little and frowned. Inwardly, she complained to herself, why isn't Chu Lu back yet? There's such beautiful scenery yet. Wouldn't it be nice if we sat here with some barbecue and wine? Why do I have to entertain these snobby and pretentious noble misses here? How boring. Pan Nianzhen was timid and senior servant was still keeping an eye on her, so she simply sat at one side and watched the noble misses in the center playing the zither and painting. There was envy in her gaze. Suddenly, there was a burst of movement from the crowd. The ladies gathered together and pointed at the wall separating this garden from the next one, chattering in excited tones. Pan Nianzhen stood up in curiosity and followed where the ladies were pointing. Chapter 447, News reaches the capital. 2. Through the thin muslin veils, they could see a tall man through the holes in the walls of the courtyard. Although he gave off a gloomy aura, that exquisite face looked like it had been sculpted by the heavens, as if he had come straight out of a painting. He had upturned eyes and the space between his brows was slightly wrinkled. His elegant hands moved as if they were plucking at their heartstrings. The young man was dressed in blue from head to toe, with an azure brocade robe and a darker navy cloak. There was a jade amulet hung at his waist and a crown tied in his hair. He looked like a brilliant and noble man. The way he carried himself dazzled the eyes of most of the ladies there. Pan Nianzhen was staring with her eyes wide herself and it took her a long time to regain her senses. It was the first time she had ever seen such a good-looking man. Excited snippets of chatter filtered into her ears. Sir Shao. He's the top scholar this year. Old Duking must be proud. Pan Nianzhen soon found out what that man was called, Xiao Bojian. He had been a talented student in the Imperial College and was now a rising official in the court. A promising youth. With looks beyond measure. In this short moment, Pan Nianzhen had already fallen for Xiao Bojian. Although Xiao Bojian was on the other side of the courtyard wall, he could hear the excited discussion from the young ladies on this side. He cast a casual glance their way. His gloomy expression and perfect features made him seem like an abnormal person, but the noble misses loved that type of air somehow. Perhaps due to complete coincidence, Xiao Bojian's gaze paused in Pan Nianzhen's direction for a second. Pan Nianzhen felt her heart leap out of her chest at that look. She quickly pressed a hand on her chest. Even after Xiao Bojian had taken a seat with his back to them, she was still staring at him dazedly for a long time. This caught Royal Princess Duanjia's attention and she frowned. Who is she? Her handmaid, Jinxiu, looked to where the princess had focused before bending down and whispering into her ear, replying to Royal Princess, she's from House Jingan. Royal Princess Duanjia found that strange. She looked at Jinxiu with confusion in her eyes. Princess, she's the daughter of the eldest madam of House Jingan, surnamed Pan. This servant heard that she came to the capital from Xi'an just 2 days ago. Royal Princess Duanjia glanced at Pan Nianzhen once again, her brows still furrowed. She made a mental note of this event and looked towards the courtyard wall as well. Her next reaction was a light snort. She disliked Xiao Bojian at first sight. He might be slightly better looking than most men, but he was purposely acting in such a way to tempt young ladies. How shameless! Although this was a disguised matchmaking party, there were no further incidents. The noble misses stayed in Plum Pavilion until it was close to midday and they were taken to the banquet by Royal Princess Duanjia. They had only been sitting in the lunch banquet for a while when good news came from the palace. Princess Wei was seated at the head of the female guests. Although none of the ladies in the inner court of the palace had come today, the Empress Dowager and Empress had each sent their trusted servants over with gifts. They likely hadn't come so that they wouldn't overshadow Princess Wei in her birthday party. At this moment, senior servant Lan was whispering something into Princess Wei's ear with a smile. When she was done speaking, Princess Wei's eyes lit up and she beamed happily and nodded. When did this news arrive? Senior servant Lan was very happy as well. The eunuch who delivered the presents from the palace said it himself. That meant that the news was practically confirmed and wasn't just rumor. However, there wasn't much possibility that it was a rumor anyway. No one would dare to joke with such important matters. The guests seated below had noticed the joy in Princess Wei's expression by now. All of them found it strange. Princess Wei was normally more subdued in everything, even her expressions. It was rare to see her showing her emotions so openly. Now they all wanted to know what it was that her senior servant had whispered to her that made the princess so happy. It was Princess Wei's sisters who understood her the most, in the end. A middle-aged noble madam dressed in a gorgeous dress, sitting not too far down from the princess, was the first to ask, I wonder what news has made your highness so lively. Princess Wei shot a displeased look at the madam who had spoken. Second sister-in-law, are you so afraid that I'll hide the good news from you? After saying so, she turned to the hall full of noble ladies, prepared to reveal the news. Even if I don't tell you now, I'm sure you'll find out when you get home today. Everyone exchanged looks, curious about the good news that the princess had mentioned. Princess Wei gave a restrained smile. There was news from the palace that the north has come out victorious in the war with the Tuhuns. A cloak of silence hung heavy in the air after the announcement, before it burst and gave way to deafening cheers. Some madams even tried using this opportunity to fawn on the princess. Your highness must be a lucky person. Such wonderful news came from the palace today. It's double the blessings for your birthday. Princess Wei usually didn't like this kind of flattery, but she didn't speak up this time, only sending a reprimanding look at the madam. The happiest person amongst the group of noble madams was Matriarch He. Hot tears spilled over in her eyes. She had been the most worried about San Lang, out of all her grandsons. This news sent her mood soaring through the roof. They could finally have a nice and peaceful new year ahead. On the day of Princess Wei's birthday, news of the great victory of the northern troops exploded in the capital like fireworks. The Qingping Emperor was the first to receive the report, of course. He immediately summoned the messenger who had reported the news for a personal audience. TL note, the holes in the courtyard wall look like this, so that's how they can see the guys, courtyard with decorative holes. Chapter 448, Becoming a Marquis. 1. The messenger respectfully handed over Great General Qian's report to the Qingping Emperor. There were detailed records of the events in the war with the Tuhuns in the report. When the Qingping Emperor finished reading the report, his shout of approval rang 3 times, before he immediately ordered a servant to bring him a writing set. He wanted to personally write the imperial decree. Having received such wonderful news at the end of the year, the New Year's celebrations in the palace were going to be livelier than previous years. On the first day of the new year, the Qingping Emperor's decree arrived at the Jing'an estate. Matriarch He took the lead in front of the entire estate to kneel and receive the decree at the entrance between the inner and outer courts. Astonishment, apprehension and joy warred within her heart. It was completely out of her expectations that her youngest grandson, He Sanlang, had contributed the most to the victory in the Northern War. The Great Wu dynasty was at peace and their ruler was wise. It was rare for anyone to earn great military merit in a golden age like this. Even if they held equal ranks in the imperial court, the positions of the military officials could hardly be compared to the literary officials now. A noble house like House Jing'an, which had come to power using their military contributions, would find it hard to rise in the ranks now. Even for those with ambitions, it would likely take at least a decade of effort to establish a foothold in court. The previous count had passed too early, while the current Count Jing'an was stationed far away in Mingzhou. Matriarch He had actually been very worried about the future of her grandsons. She hadn't expected He Changdi to have made a name for himself just by making a trip to the northern border. This was truly a pleasant surprise. The imperial decree was written very simply, so it was likely that the proper bestowal of the rewards would have to wait until He Changdi returned to the capital. Even so, the simple sentences written in the decree were enough to leave the matriarch in a daze. The Qingping Emperor had actually bestowed the title of Marquis upon He Changdi. Marquis on Yuan. That was a whole rank higher than the count. Despite her decades of experience, Matriarch He was still dumbfounded by this. The person who had read out the decree to them was a eunuch favored by the emperor himself. He smiled and said, "Matriarch, this is such wonderful news. When the Marquis returns, this lowly one would like to join in the celebration." Matriarch He was pulled back to reality by his words. She immediately set aside all other in her head and cleared her mind so she could attend to the eunuch. "Then this old woman shall await your coming when the time comes, Gong Gong." Matriarch He accepted the decree and rewards on He Changdi's behalf and had senior servant Lu offer up a gift in return. When that happened, House Jing'an would become an esteemed house even amongst the nobility in the capital. Since her older brother, Count Jing'an, was still around, House Jing'an wouldn't be splitting up their family branches anytime soon. However, the only way for them to maintain this standard of living for the rest of their lives was to have her daughter marry into her maiden house. He Ying's slender eyes glistened. At the same time, the Qingping Emperor's decree was being sent to Liangzhou at top speed. However, as it was still winter, it would still take more than 10 days for the news to get from the capital to Liangzhou. In all likelihood, the Lantern Festival would probably have passed by the time the decree reached Liangzhou. TL note, the noble ranks go in this order: Duke, Marquis, Count, Viscount, Baron. So remember how we have the main branch and the third branch of House Jing'an. They're referred to as branches for a reason. Each of the sons of the current head of the family has their own family branch. While the current head is alive, his sons can live together in the same estate. Once he dies, the noble title is passed down to his heir and the other sons have to leave to make their own way in the world, forming their own branches. The matriarch was worried for He Sanlang because his future was uncertain, but now that he has a title even higher than his father's, his future is secured even after the family splits. Chapter 449, Becoming a Marquis, 2. Once the first day of the new year was over, the days that came after seemed to pass in a flash. Liangzhou city was still snowed in, so anyone who wanted to travel long distances had to ride the snowboat that Chu Lian had ordered to be made. According to Yuri Han, who had lived in the north for decades, the ice of winter would only melt in the second month of the year. When that happened, more than half of the snow-covered plains would turn into wetlands, which was just as dangerous as snow. Yuri Han and her sons now lived in the He estate. After spending some time with them, Yuri Han was now able to speak the common language used in the Great Wu at a basic level. Although her intonation was a little strange, there was no problem in communicating with day-to-day matters. Having survived an arduous trial with Yuri Han and her sons, Chu Lian had a great relationship with them now. Yuri Han only had 2 sons and no daughters, and Chu Lian was even younger than her eldest son Meyer Yan, so she doted on Chu Lian like her very own daughter. The barbarians were a straightforward people and weren't bound by complicated rules and etiquette like the nobles of the Great Wu dynasty. As an honest young lady born in the modern world, Chu Lian found it easy to get along with Yuri Han. They acted more like long-lost relatives around each other. The health of the 11-year-old Narisong had slowly improved after days of proper nutritious food and medicine in the He estate. Now the 2 brothers were working under manager Qin. Chu Lian had already discussed the matter of Yuri Han and her sons with He Sanlang. They were going to bring the 3 along with them when they returned to the capital, and they would stay with them from now on. The usually narrow-minded He Sanlang had generously agreed with Chu Lian's suggestion for this matter. This had caused Chu Lian to confirm it with him again, as she wasn't sure if he had heard her clearly. Only then was she sure that he wasn't joking. Chu Lian was seated beside He Changdi's bed with a bowl of medicine in hand. Finding her husband's sudden geniality strange, she asked, "He Changdi, when did you become so agreeable?" He Changdi shot a quick glance at her before he closed his eyes, hiding the flash of emotion in their depths. The changes in his mood couldn't be detected from his even tone. "When have I ever been anything but agreeable?" Chu Lian had been stirring the concoction in the bowl with a spoon. She rolled her eyes when she heard He Changdi's reply, "When have you ever been agreeable? You get into a temper if I stay for just a moment longer with Sister Hui." The tips of He Changdi's ears reddened. He then pursed his lips and remained silent. During the time they had spent together in the past few days, they hadn't been glued to each other the whole time, but they had still shared the same bed and ate all 3 meals together every day. Now, they were both more familiar with each other. Chu Lian had always been sharp-witted, so she had a much better understanding of how socially awkward her husband was now. The fact that he had pursed his lips and maintained his silence probably meant that he had justified his own actions to himself 100 times over. Chu Lian's mouth twitched. She wanted to stuff the bowl of medicine into his hands. He Sanlang intentionally stayed still, so Chu Lian could only come to a compromise. What could she do since he was still injured? She resigned herself to her fate, and lifted a spoonful of medicine to He Sanlang's mouth. It was only then that He Changdi finally opened his mouth to take the bitter medicine. Chu Lian was speechless. She had tried tasting the medicine he was drinking out of curiosity before. It was bitter as hell. If she had the choice to, she wouldn't be able to take a single sip. Wouldn't it better to just gulp it all down considering how bitter it was? Why did he insist on her feeding him spoonful by spoonful? Could it be that He Sanlang had lost his sense of taste? He even looked so happy drinking it. What a weirdo. Chu Lian started discussing the matter at hand with him only after he had finished the last mouthful of medicine. "I'll be going out later, and I'll probably only be able to return in the afternoon. The doctor will be coming to the estate later to prescribe more medicine, so let Liyue attend to him. He San Lang had initially been in a good mood. However, his wife's words immediately made his mood take a turn for the worse. There wasn't much change in his expression, as he already had a cold and handsome face, but his eyes seemed to darken a little. His aura became so imposing that it would make others freeze up, but he didn't realize that. "Where are you going?" Chu Lian knew that he was leaping to conclusions in his mind again, so she reassured him, "Get Liyue to follow me then. He'll have Wenqing and Uncle Amo stay behind to take care of things." They were husband and wife, so she didn't want to keep him in the dark regarding what she was doing. Thus, she might as well open up everything she was doing to his watch. If Liyue followed along, he San Lang would definitely trust what Liyue reported about her doings. In the end, he Changdi agreed, but he didn't forget to remind her, "Bring more guards with you." With a laugh, Chu Lian suddenly kissed him on the cheek, then quickly made her escape. The sounds of her sweet bell-like laughter resounded in the room. He San Lang was stunned by Chu Lian's sudden kiss. It was only after she was long gone that he managed to regain his senses. His first reaction was to blush hard. Luckily, there was no one else in the room at this moment, otherwise they would have witnessed the poker-faced third young master blushing after getting assaulted by third young madam. The sight alone would likely shake them to their core, and they might even worry that he had been possessed. Manager Qin had already prepared the snowboats for departure. Chu Lian was helped up onto the snowboat by Wenlan. She and Wenlan shared the snowboat with Liu. Liyue and Manager Qin sat in another. The places they were heading to today weren't too far away, it would only take about an hour to get to the closest one. When they arrived at the first area, Chu Lian lifted the curtain in the carriage slightly to look at the 6 sturdy tents nearby. There were barbarians traveling to the tent from all directions from time to time. Most of the barbarians were herding yaks, horses and goats. There were also some who carried goat and yak skins. However, they all shared one common trait, which was their skinny bodies and haggard faces. Someone with experience would be able to tell that they had become like this because of their quality of life. It may not necessarily have been caused by a lack of food. There could be a few causes for their haggard appearances. Not eating salt for a long time, or an imbalance of nutrition due to only eating meat for extended periods of time. It may even be due to them lacking coal to provide them warmth. This small area with the 6 tents in the center was a simple market specially prepared for them to trade goods. Chapter 450, Returning to the Capital. 1. Chu Lian didn't get out of the warm pen immediately. She simply lifted the curtain and watched. It was only when she was sure that everything was working smoothly here that she sent the order to move to the next spot. Just like Chu Lian had predicted, they were already back in the He estate in the afternoon. Chu Lian was so tired out from the long trip out that she quickly ate a simple meal and went off for her afternoon nap. He San Lang took this chance to summon Liyue in for some questioning. Liyue's excitement showed all over his face. The moment he entered the room, without any prompting from He Changdi, all of his words were already spilling out of his mouth like beans. "Third young master, third young madam is amazing. This servant is starting to wonder if third young madam is the reincarnation of the god of wealth. She actually managed to find a business opportunity out here in this desolate north." Hearing this, He Changdi frowned. He made sound to prompt Liyue to explain further. Liyue trembled and quickly held back his excitement to make a proper report. When Liyue finished reporting everything he had seen today, He San Lang was dumbfounded. With the convenience of the snowboats, Chu Lian had sent some men out to Suzhou to trade for large amounts of basic necessities. For example, coarse cloth, salted vegetables, coal, lamp oil and assorted grain crops. Following that, they had split them up and brought them to a few designated areas. The barbarians who lacked these basic goods could trade for them with their livestock, yaks, horses and goats. A single fat yak would get the barbarians only a single small jar of salted vegetables in return. Leiyu's eyes were about to pop out of his head from the absurdity. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he probably wouldn't have believed it. Back in the capital, a single yak was worth at least 10 taels of silver, and it was a rare commodity. Even though their third young madam was so ruthless, the barbarians were actually pleased while trading. They even looked like they had just scored a great deal instead. It made Liyue completely flabbergasted to watch. The law in the Great Wu Dynasty prohibited the trading of important resources like salt and iron to other countries. Chu Lian was an upright and law-abiding citizen, so instead of selling salt, she sold salted vegetables. Anyway, the barbarians weren't picky about it, they were happy as long as it was salty. He Sanlang hadn't expected Chu Lian to have come up with such a brilliant money-making idea. Even if they didn't process the barbarians' livestock, they could sell them as they were for at least 10 times the original value of the goods they traded them for. It was an extremely profitable trade. He Changdi shook his head. When he thought of how their estate had been unable to gather 1,000 taels for his mother's monthly medicine costs, he smiled helplessly. However, as a man, he couldn't let his wife tire herself out trying to earn money for the family. It was time for him to start making his own plans to earn money now. While thinking so, he waved Liyue over and whispered into his ear. This time, it was Leiyu's turn to be stupefied. His body completely froze up. He gulped hard and asked while trembling, "Third young master, what you're saying, is true?" He Sanlang's expression hadn't changed throughout this exchange. He calmly nodded in response, "Bring Tang Yen here tomorrow afternoon. Tell him that I have something to discuss with him." Liyue nodded forcefully, "This servant will do as you say." The afternoon was the most idle period of the day for the northern border camp. Sima Hui was too bored to stay in camp, so she would frequently bring her guards along with her to the He estate to look for Chu Lian. Although she was never able to get a welcoming expression from He Sanlang each time, Sima Hui had already chosen to ignore it. Chu Lian had found a chance to return the horse amulet that Sima Hui had given her, and she had explained the whole story to Sima Hui. Sima Hui was a smart person and didn't reject the returning of the gift. She simply turned to her female adjutant, who then offered up a gilded jade headdress to Chu Lian that was even more valuable than the jade amulet. He Sanlang was furious when he found out. After the day of the Lantern Festival had passed, the imperial decree from the capital finally reached the north. Anyone who had contributed to the war efforts in the army were all given some reward. Only the ones who had achieved great merits like Great General Qian, He Changdi, Sima Hui and Captain Guo were to receive their rewards back in the capital. Everyone knew that the emperor had bestowed the title of Marquis upon He Changdi. Although many of them were envious, they admired him first and foremost. It was He Changdi who had contributed the snowboats in time and gone to Sioux City with an elite group to bring supplies back to save them. He had even gone up against the Northwestern Army and Xiao Bojian to do so. Without him, the northern border troops wouldn't have been able to come out victorious in the war. Although transporting the supplies was a small matter, it had been the key to victory. The dangers he had faced while doing so weren't any less than facing the Tuhuns in battle. Furthermore, He Sanlang had killed just as many Tuhuns on the battlefields as they had. Thus, his brothers in arms in the army were all happy and satisfied to see that he had been bestowed a noble title. Since they had already received the imperial decree and their next set of orders, the worries of the northern border troops dissipated. Chapter 451, Returning to the Capital, 2. Although only half a month had passed, the simple market that Chu Lian had opened in Liangzhou was already developing quickly. She predicted that they would be able to create a new trade route in a year or two if business went well, with the support of the northern border troops. By then, this trade route with the barbarians would likely become the best way to supply the army with good quality steeds. Even if they had to hand over a half of the profits of the trade route to the government, the remaining profits were still a good amount. Since the simple market was still in the middle of growing, Chu Lian left manager Qin, Narisong and Meyer Yan behind in Liangzhou. Once everything was stable and once they found some suitable managers to take over, she would summon them to the capital. After resting for a month, He Changdis' wounds were getting much better. Although he still couldn't walk normally, he could move slowly using some crutches. According to the doctor, He Sanlang was young and his body was in good shape. Although he had been wounded heavily this time, with enough nutrition during his recovery period, he would be able to recover quickly. After 1 more month, he would be able to walk normally. In 2 more, even riding wouldn't pose any problems. The troops heading to Suzhou formed a long line, winding through the snow-covered grasslands like a little dragon. He Changyi was seated in a snowboat alone with an overcast expression. Liyue huddled in a corner of the warm pen upon seeing how his master was in bad mood. He didn't even dare to breathe audibly. He Sanlang leaned against the wall of the warm pen with a book in a hand. Who knew if he managed to read any of it? Anyway, an hour had already passed but Liyue hadn't seen him flip the page yet. He Sanlang suddenly put down the book and ordered Liyue, "Go and ask your third young madam what's for lunch later." Liyue quickly obeyed and jumped off He Changdis' snowboat. It wasn't until he had gotten off the snowboat and switched to a horse that Liyue heaved a sigh of relief. He shook his head helplessly and headed towards third young madam's snowboat instead. Right now, Sima Hui was chatting with Chu Lian in a warm pen. Their maidservants would interject with some jokes from time to time, so there were occasional bursts of laughter from the warm pen. When Liyue drew close, he sighed inwardly. No wonder his young master wasn't happy. Third young madam had abandoned him in a snowboat by himself to come chat with General Sima so happily. It would be crazy if third young master was happy about this. In a short moment, Yuri Han had lifted the curtain covering the entrance and jumped into the warm pen. She passed Leiyu's words over to Chu Lian. Chu Lian found it funny. She asked for the time and realized it was almost time for the midday meal. She then ordered Wenlan to pass a small box of food to Yuri Han, who was to pass it to Liyue outside and send it to He Changdi. It wasn't easy to travel to Suzhou, even with the snowboats, so they wouldn't stop in the middle of the day, even for lunch. Thus, most of their midday meals were some dry rations. They would only make a warm meal when they stopped for the night. Holding the small box of food, Liyue didn't even dare to lift the curtain of his master's warm pen. It was only when He Sanlang purposely coughed that Liyue had to brace himself and enter. As expected, he was met with He Sanlang's fist. They finally reached Su City on this night. Some of the family soldiers had already gone ahead to book their rooms for the night. He Changdi had specially made arrangements in private. He would naturally share a room with Chu Lian when they reached the inn. This time, before Sima Hui could stick to Chu Lian, she had already been dragged back to their room by He Sanlang. Once they reached their room in the inn, the wooden door was slammed shut with a bang. He Changdi threw his crutches to one side and pressed Chu Lian up against the wooden door. His strong arms were placed on either side of her body, trapping her within his embrace. Chu Lian was still dazed from all the movement. She felt a pinch on her soft lips, then her mouth was open to He Changdi's plundering. His demands were both sudden and forceful. Chu Lian couldn't fight against him with the tiny bit of strength she had. The hand she had placed against his chest slowly turned limp and slipped down to grasp the lapels of his tunic. Once that domineering kiss was over, the two of them panted for breath. Chu Lian was especially flushed while her almond-shaped eyes were glazed over. Her warm and fragrant breath blew over He Changdi's chest in puffs. Although they were separated by a layer of clothing, it felt as if those warm puffs were brushing directly over his bare chest. Chu Lian quickly covered up her burning face with one hand and frowned. She used her other hand to push forcefully at the strong arms He Sanlang had put on either side of her. He Changdi, let me go. Let me out. He Sanlang cast his eyes downwards to stare at the flushed woman in his arms. His eyes darkened but he didn't speak, as if trying to carve this moment into his heart. Chu Lian couldn't push him away, but it was just too embarrassing to be in this pose, trapped against the door. She gulped nervously, subconsciously trying to hide from this intimacy. She eyed the gap under his arms and prepared to squeeze her body out from that gap. However, before she could move, He Changdi seemed to have predicted her actions. He moved his right arm so it was no longer pressed against the door. Instead, he wrapped it around her slender waist, trapping her solidly within his embrace. She wouldn't be able to escape now. His hand started kneading her waist gently, tickling Chu Lian and making her want to laugh. She started struggling and trying to escape, but his hand moved downward smoothly and landed a sound smack on her butt. TL note, the specific pose used here is called Cabotin, which some of you might have heard of. XD Cabotin. Chapter 452, A Little Fatter. 1. Chu Lian hadn't expected such a brazen action from him. She glared at him fiercely as a warning. But who could have known that He Changdi knew nothing of restraint? He continued to rub that soft and perky area with force. He leaned against Chu Lian, resting his head on her shoulder. He sniffed the faint sweet smell of her body and touched his lips to her reddened earlobes. He requested in an overbearing manner, "Lianer, you'll share a carriage with me tomorrow." Chu Lian felt that her lunatic husband had suddenly turned into an extremely possessive child ever since he had gotten injured. With what he just said, she was able to deduce the reason behind his actions earlier. Chu Lian asked helplessly, "What about Sister Hui then?" Sima Hui was a lady after all, so she couldn't just squeeze into a warm pen with the two of them. Furthermore, she had a good relationship with Sima Hui. The female general had taken good care of her while she'd been staying at the border camp. It wouldn't be right for her to set Sima Hui aside just to accompany He Sanlang. She'll be fine in a carriage by herself. After getting ignored by his wife the whole day, He Sanlang was starting to become obstinate. Chu Lian could almost feel sweat drops on her head. How had she not realized before that this man was so stubborn and possessive? He was even getting jealous over another woman. From what she understood about He Changdi, Chu Lian knew that if she didn't give him a proper answer now, there would be no end to this tonight. Chu Lian put her hands on his chest and forcefully pushed him away to create some space between them. He Sanlang looked at her with his head tilted downwards, obviously displeased. Chu Lian stared up at his handsome face and broke out into a smile. Her beautiful eyes formed into crescent moons. Watching her smile was like watching a fragrant flower blossoming instantly, and it dazzled He Sanlang. Chu Lian suddenly hooked her arms around He Changdi's neck and forcefully pulled him down. He Sanlang obediently bent over until his head was at the same level as hers. Their gazes met. Chu Lian could see every single eyelash of his clearly. The smile on Chu Lian's face widened a little more. She set her lips next to He Changdi's ear and whispered something. Once Chu Lian was done speaking, He Changdi's icy expression melted away, only to reveal sparkling warmth beneath. His pupils dilated until his eyes were like black holes, as if trying to suck her into his soul. With a husky voice, he sought confirmation from her. "Really?" Chu Lian refused to repeat herself, so she just continued smiling at him with her arms around his neck. He Changdi lifted her up with one hand at her waist and the other under her butt. With just that small bit of effort, he managed to carry her like a child, scaring her into tightening her grip on his neck. This was a lucky moment for He Sanlang. While Chu Lian was panicking, she pressed her chest against his face unintentionally. When Chu Lian finally noticed what was happening, her face was red beyond belief. Sanlang's leg still hadn't completely recovered, so despite how excited he was, he didn't dare to make any more rash moves. After carrying Chu Lian for a while, he put her down. He personally neatened up Chu Lian's disheveled clothes, before warning her with a deep voice, "You can't lie to me, or you'll face the consequences." The blush on Chu Lian's face hadn't receded yet, so when she heard what he said, she could only nod silently to gloss over it. When it was time for dinner, Liyue noticed that his master was in a much better mood than usual. He only dared to peek at him from time to time, wondering just what could have happened to make third young master this happy. Seated beside her husband, Chu Lian could obviously sense the change in him as well. The normally quiet and restrained Sanlang was now breaking out into smiles occasionally while eating. She held up her rice bowl to hide the roll of her eyes she couldn't hold back. She had only promised to consummate their marriage when they returned to the capital. Look at how happy he had become from just that. The next day, they left Suzhou the same way they had arrived, with Chu Lian sharing a carriage with Sima Hui, while Changdi sat alone. Liyue found it really odd. Third young master's good mood hadn't faded at all since he had boarded the carriage. Third young master didn't even order him to disturb third young madam during lunchtime. When Chu Lian had set out on the journey to the north, she had taken small, desolate roads so that she could get there as quickly as possible. It was different now since they weren't in a rush. She went shopping on the whole journey back to the capital. Furthermore, Sima Hui was someone who knew how to have fun, just like her, so they went around looking at all the shops and shopping crazily. She purchased plenty of local specialties along the way. Sima Hui was from a wealthy family, while Chu Lian had never lacked for money since she opened Gillen Restaurant. Thus, during the journey to the capital, the two ladies spent at least 3,000 taels between them. The carnage completely shocked Liyue into speechlessness. He mulled over how the amount third young madam had just spent was about the same as all that he and third young master had brought when they had left for the northern border. Seeing how much of a spendthrift third young madam was, he worried over whether third young master would be able to support her lifestyle. Changdi, on the other hand, didn't seem to care at all. He even ordered Liyue to follow Chu Lian, take note of what she liked, and report everything back to him later. Their trip continued in this manner until Chongzhou, where Great General Qian and the other officers caught up with them. From then on, the pace of their journey to the capital got even faster. Even though the pace had increased, it still took approximately 20 days. When they reached Jiangzhou, the closest city to the capital, Sanlang was already able to ride a horse as per normal. They bumped into Prince Jin and Erlang there, who had just settled the corruption case in Jiangzhou, and decided to return to the capital together after some discussion. Although Chu Lian and the others hadn't arrived at the capital, they had already sent letters ahead of them. Everyone, including Matriarch He, Countess Jingan and Princess Duanjia, was eagerly waiting for the couple to return by now. Chapter 453, A Little Fatter, 2, Changdi shared a carriage with Prince Jin. They hadn't met in a long time but they still got along like they hadn't parted. Prince Jin seemed much more haggard than before. There was now a gloomy cast to his abnormal azure eyes. He had also become thinner. Changdi glanced at his close friend and personally filled his cup. The alcohol warming up over the brazier today was milk wine, a local specialty of the north. Its alcohol content was low and it was nourishing for the body. They wouldn't get drunk on it either, so it fit this occasion very well. Your Highness, did you find anything while investigating the corruption in Jiangzhou? The gentle and refined Prince Jin kept his silence for a while, before raising the small cup and downing the alcohol like it was a form of release. He then picked up the pot of wine and downed another 3 cups before he managed to calm his emotions. Audi, I found something. He Sanlang's eyes were as dark as the boundless night sky when he looked towards his friend. Nothing changed in his expression, as if he had already expected the answer. Prince Jean's brows drew together and he tightened his grip on the cup. Audie, you knew this would happen a long time ago, didn't you? He Sanlang also downed his cup of milk wine in one go. His silence was as good as an answer. Back then, before you left for Liangzhou, you suggested that I should investigate this case because you already guessed what was happening. Bitterness surfaced at the bottom of He Sanlang's heart. He hadn't guessed it at all. He had experienced it all himself once. That agony was something he didn't want his friend to experience again. Since he had reincarnated, he had to let his good friend see for himself the true nature of that pair of mother and son. Even though I'm a close friend of your highness, there are some things that you wouldn't believe even if I said it outright. He Sanlang finally spoke up. The light in Prince Jean's azure eyes faded even more. He stared into thin air blankly for a while, before letting out a chuckle. You're right. If I hadn't seen it for myself, if it hadn't investigated it myself, I wouldn't have believed it even if you said it right to my face. However, now the ugly truth had been presented right in front of him. He had no other choice but to believe it. What a joke. So the people he had cared for the most had always thought of him as a chess piece that could be sacrificed at any time. He was merely a shield for the crown prince. In He Sanlang's past life, Prince Jean had been framed and sentenced to death because he had blindly trusted the ones he cared about so much. Back then, even though He Sanlang had warned him, Prince Jean hadn't taken what he had said seriously. Much later, when the matter had been brought to light, it had been revealed that Prince Jean had been framed. By that time, despite wanting to save his best friend, He Sanlang had his hands tied because House Jeangon itself had been in imminent danger. The two men fell into silence within the carriage. After a long period, Prince Jean finally spoke. Audie, I feel terrible. Drink with me. He Sanlang didn't speak a word. His only action was to pour out wine for Prince Jean personally. Prince Jean finally recovered a little of his spirit after taking a nap in the carriage. He tidied up his hair, got off the carriage and switched to horseback together with Yichangdi. The two handsome men, one dressed in black and the other in navy, riding side by side under the warm sun, formed an extremely eye-catching scene. One of them had a warm and elegant aura, while the other was more cool and stern. Prince Jean's smile evoked thoughts of spring, while He Sanlang's handsome features were cloaked in a cold yet remarkable air. They were in the outskirts of the city where the roads were wide and the weather was sunny today. Chu Lian couldn't take being stuck in the carriage any longer, so she asked Sima Hui to teach her how to ride a horse. Sima Hui specially ordered her female adjutant to prepare a gentle chestnut mare for Chu Lian, as well as a proper saddle, before she began teaching Chu Lian the basics. Chu Lian had always been both intelligent and daring. In less than 30 minutes, she was already able to use the reins to control the horse and was trotting down the highway. Right at this time, they heard the sounds of fast hoofbeats from behind, so the two ladies turned around in confusion. It was Prince Jean and Yichangdi who were coming their way. Although it wasn't Sima Hu's first time going to the capital, she had never met the fourth prince before. The man who was riding his mount over from a distance had eyes that were of a strange color. Although there was nothing reflected in those light-colored eyes, Sima Hui felt as if she saw a shadow of herself in them. Afraid that Sima Hui might not comport herself with the proper manners towards Prince Jean, Chu Lian hurriedly mouthed the words fourth prince at her. With the help of Chu Lian's hint, a trace of realization dawned upon Sima Hui and she recalled the little that she had heard about him. She had previously heard that the fourth prince was different from most people, but she hadn't thought that it referred to his eyes. In the imperial family, different-colored eyes weren't considered auspicious. Considering the fact that his birth mother, concubine Xian, had passed away when he was still a child, one could imagine that his days growing up in the palace weren't easy. Sima Hui had also lost her parents when she was a child, so she sympathized with Prince Jin's plight. A hint of kindness and tenderness showed in the gaze she directed at him. Prince Jin's abnormal eyes aside, his looks were on par with Yichang's. They were both extraordinarily handsome men that were hard to come by. When He Sanlang and Prince Jin approached them, Chu Lian greeted the prince with a smile. "Greetings, Your Highness. Genie, we haven't met for a few months, but you've somehow gotten a little fatter instead in the north. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."